Committee will come to order. We welcome and thank you for joining today's hearing entitled The American Innovation and the Future of Digital Assets from Blueprint to a Functional Framework. After brief opening remarks, members will receive testimony from our witnesses today, and then the hearing will be open to questions. I'll proceed with my opening statement. Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to our full committee hearing on the future of digital assets. Thank you to our esteemed panel of witnesses for making the time to be with us here today. This is an important and rare opportunity to discuss this committee's work to create lasting change and cement America as a global leader in innovation. For almost a decade, Congress has debated the treatment of digital assets through hearings, bills, and meetings. The House Committee on Agriculture has played a critical role in this work. Since our first hearing in 2018, our guiding principles have not changed: foster American innovation and bring needed customer protections to digital asset-related activities and intermediaries. But we are not working alone. I want to thank Financial Services Chairman Hill for his leadership and the entire Financial Services Committee for their work with our committee. We've engaged in a remarkable partnership to examine these issues and propose solutions on a cross-committee bipartisan basis. Chairman Dusty Johnson has been a tremendous leader in this effort, and I want to thank him for everything he's done. In April, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Davis held a hearing that examined the promise digital assets hold for everyday Americans. But they also learned that the promise of digital assets depends on getting the right market structure legislation across the finish line. Last month, Chairman Johnson and Subcommittee Chairman Brian Steele of Financial Services held a joint roundtable to examine digital assets with both of our committees working together. That roundtable made it clear that current federal laws and regulations do not provide adequate rules of the road for those who want to engage with these emerging technologies. That is why last week the 10 bipartisan members of the House Agriculture and Financial Services Committees introduced the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act, or Clarity Act. The Clarity Act is a product of years of vigorous debate, stakeholder feedback, and technical assistance. I want to thank Chairman Hill for leading our effort, and Ranking Member Craig and Ranking Member Davis for joining Chairman Johnson, me, and other colleagues on both sides of the aisle in introducing the Clarity Act. I'm pleased to see the committee's long-standing tradition of leading together in a bipartisan manner continue. It is incumbent on us to embrace this opportunity and finally bring certainty to the users and developers of this technology. The United States is the beating heart of global finance and innovation. Let me thank the Trump administration for elevating this issue and recognizing the urgency of action in the digital asset space and the agencies who offered technical assistance. Years ago, other nations put pen to paper and created and enacted frameworks seeking to establish themselves as hubs for the development of the digital asset ecosystem. It is time that we do our work here in the United States too and implement a framework for trusted, reliable, and useful markets for digital assets. I look forward to the work ahead in getting the Clarity Act signed into law. Again, thank you to each of our witnesses for their willingness to participate in today's hearing, and I look forward to our discussion. And with that, I'd like to welcome the distinguished ranking member, the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, for any opening remarks you would like to give.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank the witnesses for coming to Capitol Hill to share your perspectives with us here this morning. The Clarity Act is not a perfect bill, and there are improvements that I hope still can be made. However, I was pleased to join with the chairman and others on this committee to put forth the legislation because at the end of the day, we need to bring consumer protection and a market structure to digital assets in our financial system. Digital assets, including cryptocurrencies, are no longer a novel financial product. They have become and will continue to be integrated with, and in some instances, completely change our financial architecture. I believe it is critical that Congress establish clear protections for consumers and retail investors, as well as rules of the road for businesses dealing in digital assets. There are common sense regulations that the industry currently lacks, like requiring the sequestration of consumer funds for broker exchanges, ensuring consumer deposits are not misused, and that retail investors are not left holding the bag when bad actors commit fraud. I hope that these are all things that this body can agree on. If Congress does its job well with this legislation, we will hear more stories of innovation and success. Legitimate enterprises will innovate and thrive, and consumers will be able to engage with their services and products without undue financial risk. This technology and these markets are growing rapidly, and Americans are engaging at a rapid pace. We have a responsibility to be part of the solution and to protect them. But I do want to add that we cannot ignore the fact that the President of the United States is making this debate a lot more difficult. Under current law, members of Congress, judges, and their respective staffs and other federal employees may not use non-public information to trade in markets overseen by the CFTC or share non-public information with others so they can trade. This bill rightly adds digital commodities to those prohibitions, yet these limits, which apply to us, do not apply to the president. And when we have a president hawking meme coins and his family, that is a very difficult situation for this body. Our work here is critical to getting this right for retail investors, and I'm glad we're here today. I again want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing and for working with us over the course of the last week to help improve the Clarity Act. I hope we can build upon this success as the bill moves through the legislative process. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the witnesses may begin their testimony to ensure that there is adequate and ample time for questions. Our first witness today is Dr. Avery Ching, of the CEO and co-founder of Aptos Labs. Our next witness is the Honorable Michael Pivovar, who is currently the Executive Vice President of the Milken Institute. He is also a former commissioner and was the acting chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Our third witness today is Mrs. Chelsea Pizzola, a partner at Wilkie, Farr & Gallagher, LLP. And our fourth and final witness today is Mr. Ryan Miller, a partner at Lowenstein Sadler, LLP. He also chairs the Commodities Future and Derivatives Group and is the co-chair of the Lowenstein Crypto. Thank you all for joining us today, and we now look forward to your testimony. You'll each have 5 minutes. Timer in front of you will count down to 0, at which point your time has expired. Dr. Ching, please begin when you're ready.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Avery Ching, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aptos Labs, the team behind the Aptos blockchain. I hold a PhD in supercomputing and have spent my career scaling technology at Yahoo, Facebook, and now Aptos. In 2021, I co-founded Aptos Labs to advance the next era of the internet, starting with a global scale and highly secure blockchain, capable of transforming payments, commerce, digital identity, and beyond. Aptos Labs was established and is headquartered in the US. We're proud to contribute to American innovation and job creation. Aptos is a high-performance, permissionless, proof-of-stake, Layer 1 blockchain designed to support internet-scale applications and their billions of users. Like the internet, it's open infrastructure that enables anyone to build applications on top of it. Unlike centralized systems, Aptos is maintained by a distributed network of participants, validators, developers, and users. Digital assets, or tokens, are essential for these decentralized systems to function. They provide the incentive, security, and governance mechanisms that keep the network running. For example, APT is the native token of Aptos and is essential to the network's operation and to access the network. It plays 3 key roles. First, the token is used to secure the network. In order to record transactions on the blockchain, validators are selected based on the amount of APT tokens they stake or lock up as collateral. This mechanism uses APT to secure the network by preventing attacks from malicious actors. The token is also used to programmatically reward validators for truthfully recording transactions, commonly known as staking. Second, APT holders can propose and vote on protocol upgrades, ensuring decentralized decision-making. Third, APT is used to pay transaction fees. These fees, averaging fractions of a cent, are required for submitting activities to the blockchain. Even though they are small, these fees serve as a protective measure against spam and denial of service attacks, ensuring the network remains secure and efficient. Security, decentralization, and utility are what make blockchains like Aptos capable of supporting real-world applications at scale. Today, these applications are no longer theoretical. More than 1,000 developers are building on Aptos, and hundreds of live projects are delivering value across industries like finance, commerce, entertainment, and infrastructure. Some of the world's largest financial institutions, including BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, and Apollo, have launched regulated tokenized money markets and other funds on Aptos. Doing so increases transparency, enables real-time peer-to-peer transfers, and boosts operational efficiency. The PACT protocol is a blockchain-based platform for licensed lenders in emerging markets. The platform allows these lenders to originate and service loans on the blockchain, offering transparency and efficiency to lenders and borrowers alike. Over $1 billion in loans have been issued through PACT, helping small businesses access faster capital, enabling them to buy equipment, open shops, or invest in clean energy. Aptos also powers new forms of engagement in entertainment and commerce. Projects use Aptos to issue tokenized tickets, cutting out intermediaries, reducing costs, and offering collectible digital ticket stubs that drive loyalty and fan engagement. Aptos has a multi-year collaboration with NBC Universal to reimagine the fan experience through blockchain-enabled real-world experiences, loyalty programs, and interactive games. Brands like Jelly Bean use Aptos to link physical products with blockchain-verified records, enabling immersive customer experiences and greater consumer trust through traceable, authenticated products and supply chain data. The use cases we see on Aptos today are only the first step of a sweeping transformation. Just as the internet rewired everyday life, decentralized networks will form the core infrastructure of the coming digital economy, delivering systems that are transparent, interoperable, and designed for innovation, and will define how we engage with the world around us. Tokens serve a vital role in every application built on a blockchain. For blockchain innovation to grow responsibly in the US, developers need clear regulatory guidance around token issuance and distributions. We're ready to help realize that mission, and we're grateful for this committee's leadership in making it possible. Market structure legislation and well-defined consistent rules around token issuance and distribution will ensure that networks like Aptos can function as designed. US builders can innovate while staying compliant and competitive, and regulators can enforce meaningful consumer protections. The infrastructure is ready. Regulatory clarity will ensure US leadership in the next era of the internet. We stand ready to work with the committee in this regard, and are grateful for the committee's leadership. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Pivovar, please begin when you're ready.
Great. Good morning, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Mike Pivovar, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Milken Institute's Finance Pillar and the President of our newly announced Economic Mobility Alliance. The Milken Institute is committed to supporting legislation that will establish a workable framework to bring clarity to the digital asset market. My colleagues and I believe the Clarity Act crafts a framework that addresses regulatory gaps, jurisdictional boundaries, and pathways for responsible innovation. It reinforces the U.S. financial system's growth, competitiveness, and resilience. As you consider next steps in the legislative process, we look forward to continuing to work on this bipartisan issue with this committee and the House Financial Services Committee. Prior to joining the Institute, I served as Commissioner and Acting Chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. In those roles, I saw firsthand how the U.S. capital markets are the envy of the world. They are the world's deepest, most liquid, and most transparent. They are the most efficient at allocating capital from investors seeking lifetime financial security to job-creating entrepreneurs like Avery. I saw how the historical success of our capital markets has led to jobs, economic growth and competitiveness, and increased standard of living for everyday Americans. And I saw how much of that success can be attributed to the SEC's long history of focusing on its threefold mission: protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and promoting capital formation. During my tenure, I worked to incorporate dozens of rulemakings required by the Dodd-Frank Act and the Jobs Act into that mission. As we look to future innovations in capital-raising activities in digital asset markets, the critical role played by the SEC will become even more important for the United States to maintain our economic competitiveness. My written testimony focuses on the critical role that the SEC plays in regulating our capital markets and how that expertise can be applied to digital asset markets. I provide examples of how the SEC is already applying their existing authorities to do so. I also discuss how key provisions of the Clarity Act grant new authorities to the SEC that aligns its mission with the functional application to the digital asset markets. Finally, I offer a few recommendations as you consider next steps in the legislative process. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, and members of the committee, thank you for your leadership in finding bipartisan and cross-committee solutions and for building bicameral consensus to create clear and workable regulatory framework for digital assets in the United States. And thank you for the opportunity to testify on the critical role that the SEC, working with the CFTC, will provide in promulgating, administering, and enforcing regulations that align with its mission and promote innovation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Pivovar, thank you so much. Mr. Miller, please begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, and members of the committee, it's a privilege and honor to have been invited to appear at this hearing. Thank you. My name is Ryan Miller, and while I grew up in Oklahoma, I've been a financial markets lawyer in New York City for the past 15 years. I'm here to offer my voice, my support on a single message. The time to act on digital asset market structure legislation is now. I do think that the time has come, and we cannot afford further delay. My perspective on this comes from my experience in the financial markets, and I want to share some of that with the committee. I've spent my career at the intersection of market regulation, innovation, and risk. I was fortunate to have worked at the CFTC during the Dodd-Frank rule writing years, which is familiar to many on this committee. And since then, I've advised financial institutions, exchanges, and crypto firms on financial market regulation. As many of you might know, I also lived through the collapse of the FTX global cryptocurrency exchange. I was the FTX US General Counsel for a little more than 1 year. I want to start with a few observations about my FTX experience. The failure of FTX is often talked about as a run on the bank or a liquidity crisis, and this committee knows well that is not what happened. FTX was not a bank, it was a cryptocurrency exchange charged with protecting customer assets. The FTX failure was the result of a concealed fraud performed by the most senior members of the FTX founding team. As my written statement reflects in greater detail, I first learned in early November 2022 that approximately $8 billion in customer assets on the FTX global platform were simply gone. A small group of insiders at the global FTX entity had misappropriated billions of dollars and customer funds for personal use. That is not okay, and part of the goal of the legislation we're considering now is to address this issue. After learning of the revelation and the customer asset shortfall, I and a few others worked around the clock for 4 days to stop the ongoing fraud, to mitigate the bleeding, to preserve critical records, and ultimately prepare for insolvency filings. The critical point of this story is this. Had proper federal market structure regulation been in place, the kind contemplated in the bill before you, offshore companies would have come to the United States and centered their businesses here. FTX's story could have ended very differently. Customer asset segregation, regular examination, governance requirements, and auditing would have been in place, and they would have provided guardrails to prevent the fraud. And that's why I'm here today, not just to tell the FTX story and to recount the past, but to support your work to shape the future. Again, I do not think we can afford more delay. The committee's draft legislation, the Clarity Act, is thoughtful, it's balanced, it's functional, and importantly, it's ready. It creates a path for registration. It draws a sensible line between the SEC and the CFTC, and it prompts coordination where appropriate. It protects investors while enabling responsible innovation. And it gives regulators, and this is important, the tools they need to move from enforcement to proactive supervision and regulation. Critically, it also ends the state-by-state regulatory patchwork that is pushing innovators offshore. A federal framework will restore confidence and competitiveness in the U.S. digital asset markets. Regulation enables innovation, and when market structure works, it creates the foundation of trust that has allowed the frequent statement to be made about America having the most deep, liquid, and resilient capital markets in the world. Crypto is capital, and if we want the digital asset markets to grow here, adopting legislation is a must-do. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today. I appreciate the work this committee has done, and I stand ready to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Miller. Ms. Pizzola, please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, members of the committee, it is an honor to testify before you today. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the current draft of the Clarity Act of 2025. I previously served as the CFTC's Deputy Chief of Staff and counsel to former Chairman Heath Tarbert. I've also served as Head Regulatory Counsel to Cumberland DRW, a large participant in digital asset, spot, and derivatives markets. Currently, as a partner at the law firm Wilkie Farr & Gallagher, I advise clients on CFTC and SEC regulatory matters, including matters involving digital assets. In these roles, I've seen firsthand the confusion, misallocation of resources, and barriers to innovation and competition caused by the lack of jurisdictional clarity regarding digital assets in the United States. Legislation is needed to remove permanently any jurisdictional ambiguity. As Mr. Miller said, the Clarity Act's allocation of jurisdiction between the SEC and the CFTC along the line between primary and secondary markets is appropriately tailored to each agency's specialized expertise, experience, and statutory remit. The SEC is well suited to regulate primary market transactions in digital assets, which are often viewed as similar to capital raises involving traditional securities that have long been under the SEC's remit. Equally, the CFTC is the natural regulator for secondary market digital asset transactions, which are widely viewed, including by multiple federal courts, as transactions in commodities. Although the CFTC currently does not have plenary regulatory authority over spot commodity markets, it has anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authority. And the Commission intently monitors and surveils spot commodity markets, given the close relationship between derivatives contracts and their underlying commodities. In short, the CFTC has spent the past 50 years dedicated to understanding and improving commodities markets and markets for commercial risk transfer, including in the exercise of its exclusive regulatory authority over futures, options on futures, and swaps, referencing commodities. The CFTC has also had an extensive history of engagement with digital asset markets through the authorities that I've just described. Since 2015, it has aggressively and successfully pursued fraud and manipulation in spot and derivatives markets, as well as failure to register cases involving digital asset derivatives. It worked closely with exchanges and their clearinghouses to prepare for the first Bitcoin futures listings in 2017, and it did the same with Ether futures listings in 2019. Today, these markets are deep, liquid, and transparent, and are well policed by the CFTC for fraud, manipulation, and trade practice violations. This record on digital assets is consistent with the CFTC's 50-year tenure as a preeminent markets regulator. Today, a total of approximately 40 million futures contracts are traded on average each day on CME Group and ICE derivatives exchanges alone. And in the OTC derivatives market, total U.S. reported notional traded in interest rate swaps alone was approximately $112.7 trillion during the third quarter of 2024. CFTC-regulated markets and market utilities have steadily performed their risk transfer and shock absorption functions through periods of extreme volatility, such as negative oil pricing and other shocks at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, the CFTC is also well-suited for its responsibilities under the Clarity Act by virtue of its statutory core principles-based regulatory framework for exchanges and its self-certification process for new product listings, which were specifically designed to promote responsible innovation and fair competition. The statutory core principles are outcomes-based requirements, and exchanges are given reasonable discretion in determining how to comply. This has prevented the kind of rigid, one-size-fits-all regulatory environment that previously stifled innovation and competition in CFTC-regulated markets prior to the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. The self-certification listing process has supported innovation and competition in CFTC-regulated markets, reducing the time to market for new products from years to days. These flexible, adaptable regulatory approaches are particularly well-suited for the novel and constantly evolving nature of digital asset markets. The Clarity Act appropriately includes these features in its regulatory regime for digital commodity exchanges. And there is no better agency to implement such a regulatory framework in furtherance of responsible innovation than the one that has done so for the last 25 years, allowing for the markets under its jurisdiction to become the largest and the most vibrant and robust of their kind in the world. Finally, just returning to allocation of regulatory authority between the CFTC and the SEC. De minimis registration exemptions in areas of overlapping jurisdiction and interagency coordination and deference are valuable tools to reduce regulatory burden and promote regulatory efficiency. But beyond these limited exemptions and targeted deference, holistic CFTC oversight of the secondary digital commodity markets is necessary to avoid fragmentation in market regulation, monitoring, and surveillance. Yet ultimately, exactly how the line is drawn between CFTC and SEC jurisdiction is less important than ensuring that a clear, durable line is drawn through lasting legislation. We should not allow inaction to perpetuate an environment of regulatory uncertainty. Digital asset entrepreneurs and the American people deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mazzola. At this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members, and in order of arrival for those who joined us after the hearing convened. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes, each in order to allow us to get to as many questions as possible, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mrs. Pizzola, in your testimony, you mentioned there is no better agency to implement a bill like the Clarity Act and further responsible innovation. Please explain why CFTC is best suited and how it is uniquely situated among federal regulators on this front.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I believe the CFTC is best suited to regulate secondary digital commodity markets in furtherance of responsible innovation because of its experience, its expertise, and its statutory remit. It currently monitors and surveils spot commodity markets closely, given the close relationship between derivatives contracts and their underlying commodities. It's engaged in that activity for 50 years, and its predecessor did so before the CFTC was established. And it's spent the past 10 years engaging productively with digital asset spot and derivatives markets. We saw this through its efforts to promote integrity through its very vigorous enforcement program, rooting out fraud and manipulation, as I said, in both the spot and derivatives markets. We've also seen this in the CFTC's oversight of the launch of Bitcoin and Ether futures, years ago now, that have since become vibrant, well-policed markets. We've seen this, as Mr. Miller mentioned, in the FTX bankruptcy. We saw that the CFTC regulated entities within the FTX group were the only ones that were able to return all customer funds without any loss, without having to go through the bankruptcy. And that, again, as Mr. Miller said, is because of sort of the diligent oversight and examinations that CFTC staff had and engaged in regularly to prevent the sort of misappropriation of funds that happened with other entities within the group. So essentially, I would just sum up and say that the CFTC has 25 years of experience in implementing the kind of flexible, core principles-based framework and self-certification process that here, I think are key elements of the Clarity Act's regulatory regime for exchanges. And they've proven over time to support responsible innovation through thousands of product listings, dozens of new market entrants. And I really just think this is the right structure for digital asset markets, and the CFTC is the right regulator to implement that structure given its experience.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Miller, thank you for sharing your story. In the FTX collapse, the only FTX entity in the United States with federal regulatory oversight was the FTX U.S. Derivatives, which is overseen by CFTC. Please describe for us how CFTC's oversight of FTX U.S. derivatives spared it from getting wrapped up in the activities of the FTX foreign entities.
Thank you, Chairman. Great question. FTX U.S. Derivatives was registered with the CFTC, both as a designated contract market and a derivatives clearing organization. The tools in place were very simple. Customer assets were held at a third-party custodian, segregated from the treasury and company assets of FTX U.S. Derivatives. Customer assets were in separate accounts. They were subject to rule and legal structures that protected them as such, and they were not able to be accessed either by FTX U.S. Derivatives or the broader enterprise. It's not more complicated than putting U.S. customer assets in a segregated place and protecting those with law.
Are you concerned something similar to the FTX debacle could occur in the United States if digital assets market structure legislation is not enacted by Congress, and how urgent is it that Congress act?
Another great question. I started my statement with urging prompt action, and I believe that sincerely because what we have now is a 50-state regulatory program that doesn't necessarily impose governance requirements, examinations, audits, and the types of standards we see at our federal markets regulators. I think the states do a great job at making sure that their standards are followed and that their registration requirements are met. However, we have the 25 and 50 years of experience at our federal markets regulators to bring to bear, and this statute allows that to happen.
So how would clarity prevent an event like that from happening?
So the Clarity Act, as drafted, the most important point is that it prompts registration. The registration brings in examinations, auditing, governance requirements, independent directors, and record keeping. That tool set allows both regulators and the governance body of any entity to ensure that what the entity says is happening is taking place. And so the registration provisions and the accompanying compliance programs in the Act do clearly what we're asking for in this space.
It's my time, and recognize gentlelady from Minnesota, Ranking Member Representative Craig, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin with a focus on consumer protection, and a key component of that, in my mind, is educating your customers. The better we can increase the financial literacy and risks for retail customers, the better prepared they will be to face those risks and the opportunities that these new markets present. In addition to establishing a regulatory framework for digital commodities that includes important basic protections for customers like segregation of funds and disclosures, the Clarity Act would also require the CFTC and the SEC to jointly study how to increase financial literacy of retail digital commodity holders and improve their coordination on customer education in this space. For those of you on the panel who have experience working at the CFTC or the SEC, can you talk to us a little bit about the agency's respective customer education programs, and do you have any suggestions on ways we can help improve customer education and outreach surrounding digital commodities?
I'll go first.
Thank
you.
you.
At the Securities and Exchange Commission, there's an office dedicated to this. It's called the Office of Investor Education and Advocacy, and they engage in a number of financial literacy or financial education type programs. They actually have their own website called investor.gov, that separate and apart from the SEC's website. And there's a number of different things that they do to try to educate folks. There's an entire page dedicated to digital assets and investing in those assets. Also, I mentioned in my opening testimony that the SEC is already using its existing authority in the digital asset space, and one way they're doing that is issuing staff statements to let people know various things. So, for example, they've said meme coins are not securities and do not fall under the federal securities laws, and so therefore you do not have the protection of the federal securities laws from that. Basically, a caveat emptor to letting them know those sorts of things. They've issued a number of other statements on other things, proof of work staking, proof of other sorts of things that they've done too. So they have a number of different mechanisms for doing that.
It's a critical moment in time to make sure that investors know those are not protected. With respect to the CFTC, any comments there?
I can start, Ranking Member, and then my colleague, Mr. Miller, can jump in. Yes, the CFTC does have, like the SEC, as many here may know, a separate Office of Customer Education and Outreach. And it has been, engaged in the past, I believe it's almost 10 years now in educating customers regarding digital assets. It put out, virtual currency primers explaining, what is Bitcoin, what is Ether, what are virtual currencies, sort of things of that nature. I believe almost 10 years ago now. And since then, it's sort of had regular engagement events, an annual sort of CFTC virtual currency or blockchain day. Sometimes that's part of a broader blockchain week that's held in Washington, D.C. with different universities. But I certainly, Ranking Member, agree that more could be done, particularly in the outreach arena. I think making sure that more customers are aware, sort of more customers are sort of knowledgeable of the types of fraud and other abuses that can take place. There's always more to be done in that arena, but I do think the CFTC has engaged in robust efforts in that regard.
Let me just ask two more quick questions because I'm running out of time here. Mr. Miller and Ms. Pizzola, let me just ask you, does the CFTC, in your view, have the current resources that would be necessary to regulate this space appropriately? Mr. Miller, yes or no, and maybe 10 seconds?
Yeah, it's an agency where resources are critical, and I think it's important to focus on funding the agency at the level of resources it's requested.
Thank you. Ms. Pizzola?
I agree with that.
Great,
Yes, ma'am.
excellent. Let me just close with a final question to each of you. Obviously, there's been a lot of activity from the president and his family in this space. I told you what I thought about that he should also be added, as well as the vice president, to those folks that are included in the legislation. Under current law, members of Congress, judicial officers, legislative, judicial employees, et cetera, are all prohibited from using non-public information that they acquire because of their position to trade in those CFTC markets. Current law prohibits the same list from telling others, such as non-public information for those trading on those markets. The Clarity Act rightly adds digital commodities to these prohibitions. Do you believe these prohibitions should apply in the same way for the president? Mr. Miller?
So I think what the Act does is bring about transparency and disclosure requirements that apply to all participants in these markets, and I think that's appropriate.
Thank you. Ms. Mazzella?
I couldn't agree more. I think the disclosure requirements of the Act are appropriate, and it's appropriate that they're broadly applied.
I'm going till Mr. Chairman cuts me off here. Any other? Yes? Should those prohibitions apply to the president and vice president?
The meme coins are not under the jurisdiction of the SEC, so no comment.
Okay. Mr. Chang, just because you're here.
I agree with our colleagues that the more disclosure and the rules formed by this commission are going to really help with that in the future. Thank you.
Not quite the same as prohibition, but thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. And I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pivovar, what are the challenges posed by the regulation by enforcement approach that the last administration took? In other words, why does Congress need to provide a comprehensive regulatory framework for digital assets so the SEC is not depending on after-the-fact enforcement?
Yeah, Congressman, I almost want to call you Mr. Chairman, but Congressman, thank you for that question. The regulation by enforcement by the last administration had a number of negative effects in the market. So as Mr. Miller testified, it forced a lot of folks to go offshore rather than having customer assets be protected within the regulatory framework. It was not only regulation by enforcement, but there was no actual regulation going on in there. There were actually firms that were going to the SEC begging them to regulate them. Please regulate us. We want to be regulated under the framework to protect the customer assets, as they were saying. And so there was a lot of innovation that went offshore, a lot less protections for consumers. And one that I think that is underrated negative consequence was that it wasted SEC resources for 4 years. There were dozens of staff members pursuing cases that were not under its jurisdiction. They lost multiple times in court. And those were resources they could have used to provide clarity in the regulatory space. And now they're catching up, but that was 4 years wasted.
Dr. Ching, as you and I discussed yesterday, the ag and energy industries are often leading the change when it comes to innovation and technology advancements. Can you talk about some of the challenges our rural producers face when regulations fail to keep up with the new technology?
There's a lot of innovation that can happen right now inside of rural America and agriculture. Some of the examples of that we've seen in the past are in this committee's hearings have been cattle tracking, data lineage, and more. Blockchain is one of those great equalizing technologies. As long as you have internet through a phone or other device, you can access the pure power of a decentralized network that is globally accessible. We're very excited about the work that this committee is doing to help advance these technologies and make them more accessible to developers who can help build these technologies in agriculture and rural America.
And Mr. Miller, by the way, thank you for maintaining that Oklahoma tone of voice and logic. Would you care to comment as well as a fellow Oklahoma State guy?
Thank you, Congressman. So Access to new technology is often gated by the providers of the technology and the willingness of users to adopt it. And oftentimes that's gated by legal and regulatory certainty. And given that we've just gone through, as Commissioner Pivovar described, 4 years of enforcement on every corner of the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, there's no certainty to these rural users that they're allowed to engage with this technology. The Clarity Act and the work of this committee will bring that clarity and allow more access to take place.
Mrs. Pizzola, can you talk about the necessity of addressing the spot market gap? How does the Clarity Act provide regulatory certainty for the spot market trading of digital commodities?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, I believe that the Clarity Act does provide very beneficial clarity in the spot markets. Today we do have, as Commissioner Pivovar said, essentially a sort of morass of confusion when it comes to whether particular transactions are under the SEC's jurisdiction or are sort of spot commodity transactions that are not regulated other than under the CFTC's anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authority. We did see under the prior administration, case after case, time wasted, resources misallocated, and just general confusion. And it really did deter market participants and entrepreneurs from participating in the space and drove well-meaning firms, both entrepreneurs and financial institutions, either offshore or just out of the digital asset markets altogether. And I think the Clarity Act really does provide a beneficial set of rules of the road that really draw a clear line between the SEC and CFTC jurisdiction, and has the sort of registration, examination, auditing that Mr. Miller referenced, as well as customer fund segregation requirements, disclosure requirements, other important aspects of a regulatory framework that you would need in order to sort of have clear rules of the road and ensure that these markets can flourish.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Brown from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, for calling this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. As the representative for Ohio's 11th Congressional District, I am proud to represent a region with a legacy of innovation rooted in service to working families. From Garrett Morgan revolutionizing traffic signals to Charles F. Brush perfecting electric lighting, my district has a history of leading innovative technology. That legacy lives on. Case Western Reserve University has been collaborating with Highland and DataSwift to develop verifiable blockchain-anchored digital credentials. And just down the road, our world-class hospitals are leveraging artificial intelligence and advanced learning algorithms to protect patient privacy and improve care. This is what innovation looks like, but innovation without guardrails invites exploitation. Digital assets aren't just about cryptocurrency or speculation. They're about the next generation of technology, finance, and market participation. From enabling faster payments to powering digital identity, the potential is enormous, but so are the risks. Today's regulatory framework is fragmented, outdated, and insufficient. Consumers don't know who's protecting them. Companies operate in a fog of uncertainty, and bad actors are exploiting the vacuum. The time to act on cryptocurrency and digital asset regulation is long overdue. The last few years revealed a systemic failure to protect retail investors from fraud, misconduct, and abuse, and accountability remains elusive. And the risk isn't behind us. It is still unfolding at the highest levels of government. President Trump has reportedly profited from meme coins, a clear conflict of interest. It should concern every American that someone can spend $2 million to get a literal seat at the table with the president. Reports indicate that the president and his family have increased their net worth by nearly $3 billion thanks to crypto investments. And 40% of the president's net worth is now tied to crypto. This isn't just about ethics, it's about oversight. We need clear, consistent, and forward-looking regulation, not just to protect consumers, but to give businesses the certainty they need to innovate and grow responsibly. Mr. Miller, you had a front row seat to the FTX collapse. In your view, are current regulatory frameworks capable of protecting retail investors from the kind of misconduct we saw there? And what critical protections were missing that allowed billions in customer assets to vanish?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think the tools that we want to bring to bear are capital requirements, customer asset segregation, examination, and audits. And those are the tools baked into the current draft of the Clarity Act. When you bring that set of tools and regulatory programs into an entity that's holding customer assets, that gives regulators the ability to enforce what the law says.
Thank you. Dr. Pivovar, even if agencies like the CFTC or SEC have rulemaking authority, they may lack tools to ensure transparency and consumer redress. Should they, or possibly the CFPB or another regulator, be empowered to develop a national digital asset consumer protection standard? And if so, what should that include? Disclosures, recourse mechanisms, or real-time fraud monitoring?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I believe that the SEC and the CFTC have the tools and the necessary authorities, not only the existing ones, but the ones provided in the Clarity Act. In particular, I note that the Clarity Act exempts digital commodity issuers from traditional securities regulation. However, it applies a very tailored approach using the SEC's expertise. So the SEC provides disclosures not only for public companies, but also for investment companies like mutual funds, ETFs, closed-end funds. They have the expertise and the tools to apply those that fall under their jurisdiction, and I have the confidence that the CFTC also has under theirs.
Thank you. And Ms. Pizzola, if Congress fails to act, what do you believe the long-term consequences are for low-income and minority consumers who already face deceptive marketing and limited financial protections?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I believe that financial institutions that may otherwise support financial inclusion for those types of Americans will continue to be deterred from participating in this space, and that sort of again the types of financial inclusion mechanisms that digital assets can provide will continue to be sort of pushed offshore, as we've seen for the past several years due to the regulatory fragmentation that you mentioned.
Thank you. Discussion like today's highlight why this committee's work is so important. Through thoughtful dialogue, we can finally begin to bring digital assets out of the regulatory shadows by ensuring there are rules of the road that protect consumers, promote responsible innovation, and preserve U.S. competitiveness. I look forward to continuing this discussion with my colleagues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Generally's time has expired. Now recognize Representative Boss for 5 minutes.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, given your background and experience, is it important for market participants to proactively know which assets are subject to CFTC's oversight and which assets are subject to the SEC's oversight, and if so, why?
Thank you for the question. It is important to know who your regulator is and who your service provider's regulator is, because we have long-standing laws that govern how those assets are protected and how those assets are treated, depending who the regulator is in the case of insolvency or otherwise. And so it's critical that a customer can look at a business and understand who its regulator is.
So does it enhance customers' protection to provide clear lines so they know exactly where the guardrails are and who they're dealing with?
Absolutely.
Ms. Pizzola, you have worked at CFTC as well and on behalf of several firms regulated by the CFTC. Can you talk about the agency's principle-based approaches and why that would serve as a good fit for digital assets?
Congressman, thank you for the question. The principles-based approach that we have under the Commodity Exchange Act, it's really a flexible framework. It establishes outcomes-based requirements, and it gives exchanges and other registered entities reasonable discretion in determining how to comply. And it's expressly designed to promote responsible innovation, which we all want to see in the digital asset space. And ever since it was enacted 25 years ago, it's really allowed exchanges to tailor their compliance efforts to their unique business models. And I think that flexibility, that approach works very well in the digital asset space because of, the constant innovation, the evolving nature of the space. I think we've seen that it's supported the proliferation of a variety of new entrants in the exchange operating space, including multiple CFTC regulated platforms that specialize in digital asset products today. And so, I think it's a great fit for the digital asset industry because of those features.
I just want to say that, as we're moving forward with this, the first time I heard about any digital, obviously it was Bitcoin that everybody talked about. I was in church, and there was a guy who had a radio show program that broadcasted with 30 powerful watts, I'm pretty sure. And it was amazing to me. He came up and he said, "You got to know about this." And honest to goodness, it has been trying to get educated. And so adding to where early on the ranking member Craig went, educating people specifically on understanding how Bitcoin, because you can get online and literally blow your head up trying to figure out what digital assets and how you work them and how you, the only thing I can compare it to is whenever we went to the paper dollar and you no longer had gold and silver in your hand. And this is the same type situation, and trying to get a wrap around to protect people's literally assets that are floating out there and try to understand how to use them is challenging, but your help is tremendous. Thank you for your input, and look forward to where we're going with this. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now, please recognize the young lady from Oregon, Ms. Salinas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Thompson and Ranking Member Craig, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. Throughout my public service, I've taken consumer and investor protection very seriously. Oregonians demand accountability for bad actors, and our state has a pretty proud history of standing up to companies that engage in practices that actually harm consumers. In fact, earlier this year, Oregon's Attorney General filed suit against Coinbase for selling unvetted, unregistered digital assets to Oregonians and Coinbase users across the country. Coinbase cost investors billions of dollars, and one of these specious cryptocurrencies at issue in the lawsuit dropped in value from $700 to $72 within 1 month of being launched for public trading on the platform. And today, the coin is valued at around $5 per share. And this question is for the whole panel. How pervasive are these kinds of scam coins across large exchanges like Coinbase, Crypto.com, and Robinhood? And have these actors or our regulating agencies made any progress to rein in their proliferation?
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman. I think disclosure on the cryptocurrency service providers' websites about the products that are made available is critical. I think many of the companies you identified do that, and they do it very well. And I think the Clarity Act will encourage more of that and will provide a federal basis for those types of disclosures. I think the industry has done a good job in the United States of ensuring that customers are aware of what they're buying when they go on the websites, and they're able to read the backgrounds of the projects behind the tokens. I think the current lawsuit by the state of Oregon is a bit of a replay of the SEC lawsuits that have either been withdrawn or defeated in the courts. And so I'm hopeful that we don't see a continuation of the states of the SEC enforcement path over the last 4 years that diverted so many resources from progress.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment?
Just to comment that I note in the Clarity Act where it provides for disclosures on the projects up front, and then also coupled with the prohibitions on certain sales by insiders, I think is a very good consumer protection. It's very consistent with what the SEC requires for initial public offerings, where there's a lockup period where insiders who have inside information on their companies are not allowed to sell into the market until a lockup period expires, and they have to disclose that. So I think providing the prohibitions along with the disclosures is very helpful.
Thank you. And in the panel's view, how have these kinds of scam coins hurt the investor's perception of digital assets as legitimate investment vehicles?
I'll start with that. Thank you, Congresswoman. I think it has deterred participation, from financial institutions that otherwise would feel or may feel, particularly with increasing regulatory clarity through the types of SEC staff actions that Commissioner Pivovar mentioned. I think they may otherwise be interested in getting into the space, but are concerned about sort of scams and frauds and exposing their customers to that kind of activity. And then I think in general, it just sort of deters market participation, has left sort of a vacuum of sort of the kind of like professional and well-regulated space that we would want to see for crypto assets. I think, with the kind of disclosure and, customer protection, customer asset segregation requirements, registration, record keeping, reporting, things like that we see under the Draft Clarity Act, I think that would really, professionalize the space and address many of the concerns that you've identified, Congresswoman.
Thank you. So to the point, I think, of everything that we've talked about today with the disclosures, the segregated funds, transparency, audits. Last Congress, this committee heard testimony from the CFTC chairman, Russ Benham, that indicated the agency would need an additional $120 million of additional investment over a 3-year period to meet the demands of the regulatory framework that was set out under the FIT 21. And this framework does closely monitor what we're talking about today under the Clarity Act. How can the CFTC and the SEC, for that matter, be expected to meet the expectations laid out in this legislation without being provided additional resources? And what would some of the harmful consequences of setting forth a more regulated market structure be that cannot be properly enforced?
I'll take a short response. Thank you for the question. I think funding our market regulators has been a great return on investment for the American people, and it's been proven over the years. And so if we're going to add responsibilities, we have to add resources.
Thank you.
I'll just, from the SEC side, I note that the new incoming chair, or the new chairman, Paul Atkins, just testified recently to the Appropriations Committee on what he believed the level of resources are. So defer to him on that. I will say that the SEC is already, as I mentioned, redeploying assets from some of their enforcement staff that have been doing some of these cases that should have been focused on protecting consumers. And so they started a new, under Acting Chairman Ueda, started a new, I think it was called the Cyber and Emerging Threat Unit, that specifically focuses on these types of things. So I think redeploying resources is one way that they can do that.
Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from the Buckeye State, Mr. Taylor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Craig, for holding this hearing, and thank you very much to the witnesses for their insight, time, and the sacrifices you made to be here. As representative of a large swath of Appalachian Southern Ohio, one of my main priorities is to support policies that promote economic development and job creation. And while the digital assets industry is still in its early stages, many innovators are already using blockchain technology to improve the daily lives of Americans every day. Dr. Chang, can you describe the value of digital assets today and their potential value in the future for small businesses and Main Street Americans beyond trading them on an exchange? And what I'm trying to get at is, why should the people in Southern Ohio, which is a very Appalachian district, care about what we're talking about today?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. We've heard today a little bit about how tokens be used for different kinds of purposes. I'd like to talk about the ones that I think that they're best used for. Tokens are a incredibly neutral way to interact on a blockchain. They provide governance features, staking features, which is security, as well as opportunity to do payments, and represent digital identity and verification of the digital identity. In places in Ohio and across the world, we are starting to see new entrepreneurs and new ideas being picked up in these areas to support new applications. I think one actually we talked about in the past was actually working with Ohio State on some programs for digital assets for athletic programs and others, and games. I think that this innovation is very important to support Americans, bring those small businesses across all of America, as well as it's going to help the global economy to make these products accessible from a larger standpoint. So overall, we're very excited about this committee's work to help provide much more clarity around token issuance and management to making these innovations possible.
Thank you very much. We heard testimony earlier that the one basic requirement for participation in this technology is connection to the internet, correct? Okay. my district has an incredibly large part of it that has basically no access to the internet, and I'm not the only person that has a district like that. So by show of hands, does anyone on the panel share my concern about the fairness of enacting a comprehensive cryptocurrency framework using the resources of all Americans before we make it accessible to all Americans? Nobody else concerned about that? We all are? Okay. Good. Glad to hear that. Sorry, I didn't think it was coming to me this fast. Mr. Miller, in your testimony, you described how in the absence of federal action, states have filled the vacuum for digital asset market regulation. And because we lack a federal framework, innovators are forced to navigate a complex, inconsistent patchwork of licensing regimes. As a small business owner myself, I know the last thing entrepreneurs want to think about is regulations. Every minute you spend thinking about regulations is a minute that's not spent improving your business. I don't know any business owner that would want to spend more time thinking about regulations. So in the current regulatory environment, can you describe further the steps that a digital asset entrepreneur must take if they want to scale at a national level?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. It's a great question and one that we get often. There are at least 40, maybe 45 states that have clear licensing requirements for many types of digital asset businesses that involve transferring assets between customers. Certain states, it can be a multi-year process. The cost estimate, if someone wants a 50-state program, it can be in the millions of dollars. It is a burden that many have faced and decided to not start their business in the United States.
Thank you very much. Just for clarification of my previous question, has there been an estimate of the cost that goes into building the rule-making framework? Is anybody familiar with, I know that's going to be ultimately our job, but is anybody aware of what they estimate that cost to be? It's okay
I have not seen an overall cost, but as both agencies are required by law when they engage in particular rulemakings to look at the costs and benefits of each of the particular regulations that they're putting in place. So they will be coming out on an individual basis.
Sure. So the point of my earlier question, in case it wasn't clear, is the taxpayer money from everybody is going to be used for whatever the cost of these two agencies' big framework is going to be. But until we get everybody access to the internet, they won't be able to participate in it. Is that where we are?
I'll engage this way. I think blockchain provides an opportunity for inclusion and access to financial services. And if that's the promise of it, then we need to distribute it and deliver it to those who need to access it.
So you're in favor of making sure everyone has access to the internet before we worry about this framework? I'm
exceptionally pro-internet, and
Okay.
I'm also pro-blockchain legislation.
Fair enough.
And I want to note that the Milken Institute, we worked on a provision of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has $2 billion at Department of Commerce that rural communities can apply for to get broadband.
Okay.
So
Thank
I'm
you all
happy
very
to put you in
much.
contact, yeah.
I appreciate it. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields, now recognize gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Figures, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Craig, and I appreciate everyone's involvement in pulling this hearing together and to the panel. And I also want to start with a special thanks to all of the committee staff and the committee member staff, because this is complex stuff. Like this is not simple. This is tough. It's tough to comprehend. It's tough to understand. It's tough to discuss in simple terms. It's tough. And so I want to give a special shout out and thanks to all staff on both sides of the aisle for really diving into this and becoming the experts that we need. Congressman Taylor, I was with you back here. You couldn't see us, but we had our hands up too. We agree with that issue. I represent a very rural part of Alabama for the most part. I have Mobile and Montgomery, but I'm pretty sure those are probably the only two cities in my district that most of you guys have heard of. We have a very significant rural broadband access issue. And so I too am committed and want to work with you, Congressman Taylor, to make sure that in the context of this being a future element, a significant and growing element of our economy, that we are not leaving rural America and rural Alabama in the dust simply because they don't have the ability to be able to plug into the future. And that's a real thing. You can pull up to McDonald's in my district on any school day and see it full of cars, with more cars than people are inside the restaurant, because that's their only access to be able to get on the internet to do homework. And so that's a real concern. And Congressman Taylor, I want to work with you on that going forward. Spoke to the complexities of these issues, and literacy is enormously important here, because we all hear you know, we sit here and we look very smart and educated and informed in discussing this subject, but I can guarantee you there are probably less than 20% of members of Congress who can have deeper than a surface level conversation about this issue, because it is tough. And we have the benefits of staff that can get us up to speed on it. But the average person doesn't. And so, you know, people in Alabama and Mississippi and Ohio, they don't have the luxury of having somebody to be able to explain to them what cryptocurrency is, and I believe that is what contributes to a lot of the fear and misunderstanding and misinformation that's out there about the industry. And so I want to, you know, make sure that what we're doing here in regulating this is going to contribute to enhancing literacy across the spectrum of a future, quite possibly cornerstone of the American economy. And so, Dr. Ching, what does this bill do for that in terms of financial literacy, particularly to those highly vulnerable, you know, groups and populations and communities across the country?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. And just want to address, as an industry on the product side, we were working actually really hard to support new types of applications where the blockchain can be used without the internet. And so you can imagine a world where even without internet, with using Bluetooth technology or other kind of like just person-to-person communication, you can transact in the same way and have those transactions then be finalized on a blockchain when they do connect it with the internet at some point in time in the future. This regulation is very helpful to actually define, again, the token issuance rules and having this innovation come into America. A lot of the projects we work with in the past, ourselves included, have had trouble understanding these rules and regulations and spent considerable resources to try to understand them, and ultimately delayed our token launches or forced us into you know, launching with a lot of uncertainty in the past. Other projects don't even have the resources that we have, and they've had to struggle with either moving offshore or finding other methods of solving this challenge. This clarity will be very, very helpful in helping the American innovation to happen in places in your district, in other places in rural America. And I think with that, you know, that ability and definition, it'll bring back a lot of that entrepreneurial spirit to these areas and drive for technology in those areas as well.
Thank you for that. And I am personally a believer in innovation and the power of innovation, and believe that we need a framework that encourages said innovation and continues to put America in the driver's seat in this space. But the consumer protection angle of it is obviously something that a lot of people are concerned about, and something that I think we have to be realistic about in addressing, and make sure that the framework that we're adopting has sufficient protections and means to address scams. I know the industry does not like frauds, does not like scams, does not like people abusing it. That's not good for business. It's not good for the image of the industry. And I know many players have called for regulation for a long time to root out that sort of malfeasance. And so I guess I'll channel this last question to you, Mr. Miller. In terms of consumer protection, does this bill do enough? And I'll give you a softball. Why is this bill the best way to go right now?
Thank you for the question. I mean, by certain measures, 55 million Americans own cryptocurrency. So this is a real question today. And what the bill does is require examinations, customer asset protection and disclosures, and an ongoing regulatory supervision by our markets regulators with the experience to do it. That's what the Clarity Bill does, and it's why I've been supportive.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from South Dakota, the chairman of the Subcommittee of Jurisdiction over Clarity, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your kind comments at the top of the hearing. And Mr. Chairman, as you know, the age of digital asset opportunity and innovation is here. Blockchain technology is going to improve and empower every industry, and a lot sooner than most people realize. The only question that's really before us is, where is that innovation going to happen? The only thing that is standing in the way of America being the home for that innovation and that investment is our regulatory uncertainty. Most everyone else has already figured this out. And so the Clarity Act, which has been a great joint effort between myself, the chairman, the ranking member, Don Davis, and our colleagues in financial services, is an attempt to banish that regulatory uncertainty, to unlock this innovation, unlock this investment, and make sure that those industries are empowered. And so, Dr. Ching, you have spoken quite a little bit today already about how Clarity is the path. The Clarity Act, our Clarity Act, is the path toward unlocking that innovation. Am I being too hyperbolic in my statements?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. No, not at all. I think thinking about our own journey when we started Aptos Labs in 2021, and it took us 10 months to get to launch in 2022. A lot of time and resources were spent trying to understand best practices in the space, and it's very hard. We ultimately ended up launching with a lot of uncertainty, and still have the uncertainty still today. Others are not as fortunate in this space. They don't have the resources we have, and so for them, it's been a very difficult journey to understand what is permissible, what's not allowed, how are they following the best practices for their particular protocols, their particular products. It is very challenging for that to happen. Today we have 118 employees in the U.S., and we are very much U.S. based. We still see a lot of projects happening overseas. We'd love to see a lot of the projects happening back in the U.S., and we're here to support this committee and this path forward with the Clarity Act in making that happen.
Ms. Pizzola, the Clarity Act, well, let me back up. There are some instances today when we have dual registration between the CFTC and the SEC, at least a couple instances of which I'm aware. Are the agencies able to handle that? Do stakeholders and market participants, are they able to, does it work?
Yes, Congressman, it does work today. There are numerous financial institutions that are dually registered with both agencies. You have dual FCMs and broker-dealers, swap dealers, and security-based swap dealers. And I think the agencies, while they could certainly do more in the areas of harmonization and deference and coordination, I think there are today many sort of mechanisms already in place to try to minimize the regulatory burden and cost that comes along with dual registration. For example, we have capital requirements that the CFTC has that incorporate by reference SEC requirements for dual registrants to sort of ease the burden of having to comply with both capital regimes. We have the SEC has a time-limited, no-action position for compliance with the security-based swap reporting requirements if entity complies with the CFTC's parallel requirements. There's portfolio margining that sort of eases the burden for entities that are engaged in offsetting positions and related products that are within each agency's respective jurisdiction, for example, treasuries and treasury futures. And so there are a lot of tools in the toolkit to try to minimize regulatory burden that exists today, and I think the agencies certainly could apply similar approaches under a dual registration framework under the Clarity Act.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would note that it seems like it's always easier to do nothing than to do something in Washington. It is really only a deadline that drives us to achieve something. And I would submit to my colleagues that we have a deadline before us. I believe that the next 18 months will see more innovation and more transformation in the blockchain and in the digital asset space than we've seen in the last 18 years. And every other developed country in the world has gotten this right. Now is our time. We have a deadline before us. If we want to protect consumers, if we want to unlock innovation, if we want to be the home of the kind of investment that will transform these industries, now is the time for us to get this right. And I'm grateful for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that have put serious effort into this work product. With that, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the icon of South Chicago, the gentleman from Illinois, Representative Jackson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. Once again, thank you, our ranking member, Ms. Angie Craig. This is such a fascinating topic, and my comments specifically will be going to you, Dr. Penwar. You've got a very fascinating and storied career. Particularly, I feel as if you've been here before with your great work on the Dodd-Frank Act and other good things. It seems to me that we're going through a bit of market hysteria. Our country says DEI is an inappropriate, illegal term. Only one person has said that it's ill-defined and not defined at all. There are no DEI laws, so you can't break a law that's not a law. It's an aspiration, diversity, out of many we're one, equity, equal protection, inclusiveness. You want to bring more people in. How can we make sure that there's greater market participation, and how can we get to the depth and bring people in that are currently in the margins that would have a higher barrier to getting access to information, to these resources, to be a market participant?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for that question. Right, so at the Milken Institute, as you know, you're very familiar with the institute. We spend a lot of time thinking about how do we improve access to capital for underserved populations, financial inclusion for underserved populations, and really to what end? And it's really about economic mobility. If we can provide financial inclusion for people who have not been included into the financial system, there's an opportunity for them to move up the economic ladder. So that's really what it's all about. And so we do that in a number of ways, focusing on underserved entrepreneurs, underserved communities like rural communities. We've worked with the Department of Commerce on helping to get access to federal dollars from communities that had not been able to do that. And also the providers of the capital. We have an HBCU Fellows program to put people on a pathway to careers in asset management. And a lifetime financial security program looking exactly what you're looking at is how do we get more investment opportunities for folks that maybe don't have $100,000 to invest at small dollar amounts. And that's where a well-regulated system that promotes competition is the best way to do that, because then you get competitors competing for everybody, whether it's offering access to the financial system in a brick and mortar situation or on the phone or whatever it is. The more competition you get, and we've seen that the costs have gone down and down and down over decades.
And thank you, Dr. Pivar. Another question, probably a little more technical, but I wish I had you for a few hours to talk to you all by myself. But from the capital markets perspective, efficiency and liquidity are critical drivers of innovation and growth. We accept that. How do you see the current regulatory environment impacting liquidity specifically for the formation of the crypto markets? I'm more concerned about how they reduce the bid-ask price, how there'll be the next evolution of innovation in this market.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. Given the SECs, I mentioned the threefold mandate, right? And it's the key here is, as you mentioned, liquidity, efficiency, and I would add price discovery. So if we can provide a proper framework where people feel protected, have the information to make informed decisions in terms of buying, selling, holding securities, right? That will create more efficient markets. You will have better price discovery, better liquidity for the investors, and a more efficient allocation of resources in terms of capital formation for the entrepreneurs like Avery here, and we'll get more innovation. So it's a virtuous circle.
And the last question I would ask, because I'm very much concerned about you have to grow the market, increase liquidity, all the other good drivers in there, but considering the historical access that diversity is an initiative, equity is an initiative. These things have been innovative in bringing this multicultural society together. I bring that up because diversity, if we let the markets go their way with certain access to broadband and other things, it will become inefficient. I'm trying to figure out how do we keep that as a mandate or as a goal and aspiration so that it enhances the market. It does not detract from the market. So most people say, oh, why is he saying diversity, equity, inclusion? Because I can. And I think it's very important, and it helps the capital markets. Can you respond to that, please?
Yeah, so one thing that I've been, that I mentioned when I was a commissioner at the SEC is that we prohibit some investors from investing in certain investment opportunities. And the SEC has these rules called the accredited investor definition that says, look, some things are so complex, so risky, that only sophisticated investors can invest in them. And how does the SEC define sophistication? If you're rich. If you have a high net worth, you've got high net income, you can invest in stuff. So the rich get richer and the other folks get left behind. So this is one where we can really democratize opportunities for investment by looking at the accredited investor definition and make sure that it doesn't seep into the digital asset regulation as well.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I yield back. And thank you for the extra time.
Gentleman yields back. Now please recognize the gentleman from the duck and rice capital of the country, Mr. Crawford, for 5 minutes.
I thought LaMalfa might jump in there on that one. He might have some issues with that. Oh, yeah. We'll talk about that later. For the record, though, he got that right. To follow up, Mr. Miller, in your testimony, you said running a crypto exchange in the U.S. is hard and should be. You believe the Clarity Act would continue to make it hard to run a crypto exchange and therefore protect American consumers from something like what happened with FTX?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. By saying it's hard, I mean there are compliance programs that need to be in place and you need the right level of expertise to get it correct, and you need the right level of supervision from a regulator to continually ensure that you're getting it correct. The Clarity Act, by bringing registration to these businesses, introduces that structure.
Dr. Ching, forgive me, but I'm going to ask you to describe the value of digital assets. Let's assume you're talking to somebody that doesn't know what crypto is. Like you met them in the elevator and they ask you what you're here to testify about today, and you say crypto and they have no clue what that is. In an elevator speech, what is crypto?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. It is actually hard to tell in an elevator speech. I just want to acknowledge that up front. But the way we describe digital assets is just a kind of incredibly neutral infrastructure for executing functions that are very hard in traditional world, like how do you do governance, how do you do staking, how do you support payments in a world that is global and with open, accessible, verifiable capabilities. There's no other possible technology that can support this kind of use case today. And so it's just really about a global utility, public utility, like the same way we think about electricity or water or roads, in which any kind of application can be built on top of, really a new age of the internet. And tokens are really the lifeblood of that infrastructure.
So if I heard you right, you're basically saying that crypto is an economic or a financial infrastructure.
Exactly. It is a way to transfer value between any two participants.
You want to expand on that a little bit? Because, I mean, I'm giving you an extra floor on this elevator ride to give me a little bit more time to understand exactly so that the layperson knows what we're dealing with.
Probably the simplest way to describe it, it is a utility token in which you can do payments, governance, staking, transact, and have identity all in one on an infrastructure that is trustworthy, trustless, as well as globally accessible.
So as a U.S. citizen who is fiercely concerned about privacy and stuff like that, how do I feel comfortable with those kinds of transactions? Talk about the privacy issues, how those are related to this, how you address those. Make me feel better about crypto.
That's an excellent question. Today, most blockchains support very transparent operations, which means that any transaction that occurs is going to be completely accessible to everyone to see, is replayable, and that gives also a certain type of comfort to know that there's no way the system can undo or revert those transactions. At the same time, we're very used to having our privacy when we purchase a coffee or buy a sandwich. There is also additional blockchain functionality that's coming down the pipe, though, that will support that level of privacy and confidentiality, yet be regulatory compliant. That is things that Aptos Labs and other companies are exploring, already have prototypes for. So I think there's a world where we have kind of both the benefits of transparency, where people can replay transactions, but also the benefits of privacy, where things we want to remain confidential can be confidential, but yet regulatory compliant.
And then finally, what underlies a cryptocurrency? In other words, what gives it intrinsic value? Why is it any different than, I don't know, say a Pokemon card?
In many ways, it might be thought of as a Pokemon card. I think that's a good characterization to it. But it really depends on the token and what the token is representing. As far as APT, which is our kind of native token to Aptos, it really is going to be a token that is supporting the transaction fees, prevents the denial of service attacks on the network. It supports the staking functionality, which is security in the network, making sure it can't be attacked by malicious actors. And then it supports the governance features. So whenever there's a protocol upgrade, people can vote on whether the upgrade wants to happen or not.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now please recognize Representative McLean Delaney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, for having this hearing. And I was listening to you all in my office and found it very illuminating on multiple fronts. And thank each of you as witnesses here today. As we all know, and we discussed earlier, we're in a digital revolution where values extend beyond the physical. Crypto, NFTs, and tokenizing real estate are already shaping our economy, expanding financial access and improving efficiency in places like agriculture. And I represent the 6th District of Maryland. And Maryland, we are leading the way in financial innovation and digital asset management. And I'm really excited about how digital assets can really be utilized by the agricultural industry and by our farmers. But as you know, innovation and opportunity comes with risk. And in 2022, FTX collapse wiped out billions and devastated retirees, students, and small businesses. And I think that is why, Mr. Miller, you are so excited about making sure that there is, bumpers and safeguards in this regulatory environment. So I'm eager to support digital asset innovation but there are countless examples how we just do need to have these appropriate regulatory protections. So American policymaking and regulations, it seems, needs to be in line with business and the financial environment. And while the enacted markets in crypto assets, or MiCA, regulation provides, it seems, some potential learning lessons for a unified regulatory framework. And it does seem that this Bipartisan Clarity Act improves on last year's version. So I just want to say I do look forward to hearing from you and working with my colleagues to tackle these different risks and to make sure that we have a secure, transparent environment. So my first question is really to you, Mr. POR. I thought your earlier testimony was great. Given your former role as commissioner at the SEC, I'd love to hear your insights on the MiCA framework in the EU. It seems like it establishes some clear rules for crypto asset issuers and service providers and investors. And it would make sense that maybe there are certain of those structural elements that could maybe enhance the Clarity Act effectiveness. One provision that I was interested in is the conclusion of measures that prevent market abuse, like insider trading, market manipulation, and unlawful disclosure of insider information. And there also did seem to be more of an emphasis on the traditional banks having a role in addition to the big net, our internet platforms. Do you think that there are structural elements that we could learn from within MiCA or consider with the Clarity Act in helping its overall effectiveness?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I'm not familiar with the very specific provisions of MiCA, but what I can tell you is how the SEC does learn from what other regulators do, right? So the SEC has an office of International Affairs that regularly works with regulators overseas, either bilaterally or multilaterally through an organization called IOSCO, where we kind of learn from the mistakes of others, right? So in some cases, there's a second mover advantage. You kind of learn from those. I will note that, the SEC, I mentioned the crypto task force at the SEC, they're next week will be their 5th roundtable. They've put out a list of specific questions, some of them based upon some of the things that were happening in MiCA, 48 specific questions around custody, all kinds of stuff. They've had over 100 meetings that they posted on their website. And I see a lot of the firms that have come to see them do have experience with MiCA, so they're going to
be great.
They're providing some of that information to them.
So that would be very helpful. Yeah. So I just wanted to put that up, and I might add some further questions because it just seemed like it would be a good starting point. The second thing is just I spent my background was in consumer protection and helping kids online. So I have always been concerned a little bit about consumer rights and privacy. I am concerned that this bill might weaken consumer protections by preempting key state safeguards and lacks clear language to preserve them. States like Maryland have strong protections. And I just want to make sure that we, set a regulatory ceiling instead of a floor on this. Could any of you provide examples how the Clarity Act is written will ensure that our constituents won't lose any of these consumer protections and privacy under the bill?
It's a great question. I think by pushing industry participants into registration at the CFTC and the SEC, you are pushing them into mandated know your customer requirements and onboarding requirements. It's not ambiguous.
Anyone else?
And I will also note that in the securities world where there is preemption, there still is a very important role for the state securities regulators. The SEC works very closely with the state securities regulators, including Maryland, on a number of issues where they can be very helpful in rooting out fraud.
Thank you. Well, I just believe strong consumer protection privacies are really important. So I thank you, and I yield back, and we'll submit some questions for the record.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Mann, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I represent the Big First District of Kansas, which is 60 primarily rural counties in the central and western part of the state of Kansas mostly. It's evident that both U.S. businesses and individuals need regulatory clarity around digital assets and there are currently no well-defined rules to allow businesses to operate legally and successfully within the United States. The Clarity Act will provide a foundation that enables innovation and ensures that the U.S. can lead in this rapidly evolving sector, and I appreciate the Chairman's leadership on this increasingly important issue. Without this foundation, America will continue to fall behind and risk pushing innovation abroad, which I don't believe anybody here in Congress wants, and delighted for you all being here today and being part of this conversation. Just a handful of questions. First one is for you, Mr. Miller. Can you describe the different regulatory regimes that FTX.com, FTX.US, and FTX derivatives were subject to?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Congressman. FTX US was a spot exchange and followed the 50-state regulatory program that we've talked a bit about today. FTX US derivatives was registered with the CFTC and was subject to full examination by the CFTC. FTX International operated on a patchwork of registrations and licenses globally that were very much unclear at the time and remain unclear, certainly when compared to what you would get from the Clarity Act.
So of the three, I guess, can you indicate kind of what you believe are the benefits or drawbacks to each different silo, if you will?
Sure. So the business in each of its verticals was a centralized exchange, and the most powerful regulatory piece was clear customer asset segregation requirements, and that's what you got from the CFTC's registration program for FTX US derivatives. Beyond just customer asset segregation, there's surveillance. And I think market surveillance shows up in some of our state programs, but not as clearly as it does at the U.S. federal markets regulators. And so I think those are the two important pieces.
Great, thank you. Next question for you, Mrs. Pizzola. Conflicts of interest have been an increasing area of concern in the digital asset markets. How does the CFTC address potential conflicts of interest with current registered entities and registrants?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Today there are a variety of mechanisms for addressing conflicts of interest within the Commodity Exchange Act. For exchanges, there is a specific core principle that requires designated contract markets to have policies and procedures or a program in place to mitigate and a procedure to resolve conflicts of interest in the exchange's decision-making process. And then there are more prescriptive requirements for futures commission merchants with respect to their conflicts of interest. They specifically have to have policies and procedures to disclose any material incentives or conflicts of interest to their customers with respect to those customers' decisions to transact in the markets. So there is a very robust regime in place today to ensure that conflicts of interest are mitigated or disclosed both at the exchange level and then at the level of the broker or intermediary.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful clarity for people. Next question for you, again, Mrs. Pizzola. As you may know, there are no regulators who oversee the centralized spot market exchanges across all commodity markets. What is different about digital assets than other commodity markets that warrants expanded regulatory oversight?
Thank you for the question. I think one difference is that for many commodity markets, they're not centralized exchanges that are sort of similar to those that exist for securities and derivatives. A lot of commodities are commonly bought and sold in OTC bilateral transactions. And I think the difference here is that we do see digital assets often trading in a manner that's similar to securities and futures contracts, both in that they're available for trading on centralized exchanges and that they're sort of more readily accessible to retail and more widely traded by retail. It's easy for a retail market participant to just use their phone to buy crypto assets. They couldn't do that with oil and gas in the same way. And I think as we talked about, that's not inherently a bad thing, that there's financial freedom, financial inclusion that comes along with that. But then I think that also brings sort of a dynamic of, more of a need for retail protection perhaps than we'd see in other markets. I think also just finally to wrap up, it might make more sense for states to regulate in the area of, other commodities where, there's sort of those transactions in the spot markets are taking place at a single physical location within the state. I think here, crypto assets are sort of inherently borderless, inherently sort of in interstate commerce. As we talked about, you typically need the internet in order to be able to transact in them, absent sort of some of the new technologies that are coming online. So I think it's just sort of inherently, sort of an interstate problem that requires sort of federal regulation in a way that other commodities, perhaps do not.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Budzinski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also do want to thank our Ranking Member Craig and also our Subcommittee Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Davis as well, and all of our collective work on these sets of issues related to digital assets. After the release of the Clarity Act, I'm grateful for the opportunity to engage directly with stakeholders today on this important legislation. So I just want to say thank you to the panelists for being here. It is important to me that Congress takes steps to address the lack of structure and regulatory clarity for firms, consumers, and other players in the digital asset industry. That's why I was glad to work on a bipartisan manner with the chairman and his team last Congress on FIT 21. And to support that as it got over the finish line in the House, especially as some of my major priorities were included in that bill. One of my priorities sought to preserve consumer legal rights and flexibility to ensure that protections and ability to recoup their assets in the event of a market collapse. And the other was prior approval for products before entities become fully registered, improving the process for customer engagement. I'm glad to say that I see that these important provisions have been included in this updated market structure bill, the Clarity Act, to safeguard consumers and their assets. As I look at the Clarity Act, I do have a few questions that I think this panel is very well suited to answer. Mr. Pivovar, Dr. Pivovar, decentralized finance, or DeFi, can be excluded from being regulated under some provisions of this act. How could a regulator protect customers in a truly decentralized environment where there is no responsible entity and no traditional custody of assets?
Yeah, great question. Couple responses to that. One, note that I mentioned the SEC Crypto Task Force is doing a number of roundtable. One that they've already had and one that they're having next week are specifically dedicated to DeFi, looking at trying to get those answers. Second thing I'll note is that I remember when I was at the commission and we had a lot of conversations with folks on talking about DeFi, and there was no regulated entity there. And I said, well, how do you do that? And one of the responses was, well, smart contracts. Well, explain this to me. Well, smart contracts, basic computer code. I said, what does a computer code do? They said, well, basically routes orders on the way that customers do, the way they want them to do, and instead of being a broker-dealer. And I said, did you take transaction-based compensation for that? And the code, could you do that? Yes. That's the legal definition of a broker-dealer. So what some people claim as DeFi is not truly DeFi, and those are the thorny issues that the SEC and the CFTC actually have to get to. And to your point on what really is DeFi on that,
right.
What I like about the Clarity Act is there's a specific study in there to look at those particular issues, because there's smart people like Avery in here, way smarter than me to think about these things. But I don't know the answer to that, and the SEC and CFTC don't either, and so they're continuing to evolve and learn from folks. So.
Great, and I'm glad that conversation sounds like is continuing next week with some roundtable discussions on this point, so thank you. My next question, Mrs. Pizzola, would you be able to answer, elaborate on this point as well around DeFi?
Congresswoman, thank you. Yes, I think it is appropriate, certainly as Dr. Pivovar said, to continue to study DeFi. I think it's certainly a nascent area of innovation that I think we don't want to see sort of quashed by sort of rushing to regulate it in the same way as sort of centralized markets. But I would also agree that if you have sort of activities that sort of closely resemble activities that are taking place sort of in a more centralized market, then I think we would sort of question whether it truly is DeFi. I think one sort of unique aspect of DeFi that sort of maybe warrants regulating it differently from centralized finance is the fact that under a truly decentralized setup, you sort of would have participants self-custody. They wouldn't be sort of giving control over their assets to a third party. And so I think that's sort of a fundamental difference from sort of the intermediaries that are regulated under the Clarity Act, where they are taking custody of customer funds, and so we do need to make sure that segregation and customer protection measures are in place.
Okay. Mr. Miller.
Yeah, maybe to share a thought on DeFi. Our current regulators have statutes that give them the authority to do something here. And that could be a safe harbor, a pilot program, but the benefits of those is they get to put conditions on them. And those conditions might look like the Clarity Act in certain respects, but it's a tool we want to keep on the table.
Okay, great. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Congresswoman Dela Cruz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important hearing today on American innovation and the future of digital assets. I would also like to thank our panel of witnesses for their time today. Mr. Miller, thank you for sharing your recollection around the collapse of FTX. Learning from that failure is an important part of why we are here today. We want to make sure that there is never another collapse like this in the United States. In your testimony, you described the collapse of FTX as insolvency due to fraud. How would the Clarity Act protect against this behavior?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Insolvency means the assets that are meant to be there are no longer there. And in the context of cryptocurrency businesses, we're usually talking about customer assets. The Clarity Act requires customer assets to be held in a segregated and protected way, and in a way that they cannot be taken by not customers.
So there are several of our farmers and ranchers listening to this hearing today, and like many Americans, saying, what does this have to do with ag? Why is this important? Does anybody on the panel want to answer for the viewing public today on why this is so critical to the future of our farming and ranching communities?
I mean, I said I was from Oklahoma, so I should start. I think it's about payments and the flow of transactional finance. Every one of the constituents you mentioned are running businesses, and they want access to credit, they want access to easy and transparent payments, and they don't want to be stuck behind a broker or an agent unnecessarily. So I think that's a critical component of why it's interesting to anyone running a business.
So to those listening today, does that mean they could get faster payments for their products?
I would defer to Dr. Ching.
Happy to, and thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Definitely. So I think, to my colleague's point, payments infrastructure on blockchain is immensely much more efficient than traditional payment methods. Today on Aptos, you can send money around the world for a hundredth of a cent and have it settle in under a second. And it's globally accessible. It's not something that is limited to one area or another. So I think it's a crucial technology for anyone running a business, as he said, to be able to support this technology and also build in programmable infrastructure. So not only can you have payments, you can have things that happen after those payments, maybe settle other accounts simultaneously. And so those combinations are just going to be very powerful for anyone running a business and supporting the newest generation of Web3.
So what this really means is this is transformation for our farmers and ranchers, because what I'm hearing, and for the American public listening today, the everyday common person, if a farmer rancher is able to get their monies faster, that means they can buy more product faster, right? And they can harvest faster, and that means growth for their family farm, perhaps even future generations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Also, there's no credit risk. There's no other settlement risk that comes into play. So it's just a much more efficient financial infrastructure for everyone.
So no credit risk, no settlement risk. That's a pretty good deal for our farmers and ranchers. So it's important that we have some type of regulatory infrastructure in place so that farmers can use these tools to grow their farms and for the future generations in farming. Would you all agree? Would you all like to say something? Would you like to say something?
Yes, Congresswoman, thank you. I would agree as well. I would just add that I was, inspired by the subcommittee hearing back in April where, we had, I believe it was called Cattle Proof and GeoNet, but in particular, I think sort of the Cattle Proof story of, previously having had purchases of cattle using checks that maybe took days or weeks to clear, and now being able to instead receive payment, sort of almost instantaneously, I thought, really shows what Dr. Ching is speaking about in kind of a real world use case of being able to have sort of those instantaneous payments. And I think that's very promising technology that, as you said, can allow for, growth because you're sort of getting your money faster and able to deploy it within the business for farmers and ranchers.
And it sounds like for planning purposes, right? If you have a check, it can bounce. Then you still have to chase the buyer of the product, get a new check or get another form of money. All of that takes time. But when you have immediate access to capital, that means you can plan for the future, you can grow your product, grow your market, and pass on the legacy of farming to future generations. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Riley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I think part of the backdrop for this, it seems like maybe it was a while ago, but in other ways it wasn't, is the 2008 financial crisis. I represent a rural district in upstate New York, and looking at the cutting edge of all the issues we're talking about today, it's hard not to remember Wall Street basically treating the economy like a casino. It's still really frustrating for folks that Wall Street got a bailout, while the middle class, which deserves a bailout, didn't. And people just really don't trust Wall Street still because of that. And they might be looking for, because of that, alternative places to invest. And I was texting earlier today one of my buddies from high school, Mike Chochi. He's really big into crypto and a big supporter of it. And I asked him sort of his perspective on this, and I thought it was interesting. He said crypto gives people like me, this was what Mike said, access to financial markets, kind of the way E-Trade used to do for stocks. But the thing with the stock market is it's still rigged for large players, and so he sees crypto as being more accessible for somebody like him. And I'm wondering how we can make sure that as these new innovations are happening, we don't end up kind of going down the same path, where this is something that is seen as accessible and fair for somebody like Mike Chochi and not just run by the big players. And I think that one of the lessons we learned from the financial crisis was that a lot of people just got really over leveraged, and I'm worried that we could end up in a similar situation here when I read about situations where there's digital asset trading on margins with really high leverage. And so my question for all of you is just generally with that backdrop and that still being forefront of mind for so many folks in upstate New York, what sorts of things would you tell them about the regulatory efforts and legislative efforts to make sure this works for them and not just the big players? And then more specifically on this leverage issue, am I thinking about that the right way? And if I am, what are the best ways to address it, including potentially with respect to the legislation we're considering? Commissioner Paiwar, I wanted to start with you on that, if you could give your perspective.
Sure. No, on that leverage point, I think you make a great point. Thinking back to the global financial crisis, right? What we saw was there was way too much leverage in the system that the regulators simply did not know anything about. If you think of the over-the-counter derivatives market, this is where the real credit risk was. I happened to be working in the White House during the global financial crisis, and part of my job was to look at and say, well, which banks were exposed next? And the data that we had was completely useless because the current law at the time was actually the SEC and CFTC were prohibited from collecting information on the over-the-counter derivatives market. Dodd-Frank addressed that through Title VII and split up jurisdiction, very similar to what we're talking about today in terms of the swaps market and security-based swaps market. They could have done a better job on the front end. I talk a little bit about that on my written testimony, but it now provides the regulators with the tools that they need to see the leverage in the system. The other thing we noted was that a lot of these exposures were with the banks. Mm-hmm. And so now the bank regulators need to step up and do their job. You know, the response for the last 4 years was keep crypto out of the banks because they're going to make the banks, you know, but the crypto can bring down the banks. What we saw in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, it was almost the opposite. And so what we need to do in not only with the crypto market, and as Dr. Ching pointed out, it actually takes out credit risk. It takes out market risk. It takes out systemic risk types of concerns from these markets. So I think it's actually working in the right direction.
Great, that's really helpful. Did anybody want to add anything on that?
I'll just add one thing, which is that I think there's definitely, you know, in the DeFi space, and you know, you definitely have much more kind of freedom around the products that are there. I think this regulation will definitely help to understand the protections for consumers. But the other advantage you're going to get from DeFi is going to be transparency. And so I think in those kind of previous instances you mentioned, there was a lot of lack of transparency around how much were the risks of the overall financial markets. In the blockchain space, those risks are kind of very clear and present for everyone to see and analyze and kind of understand and then kind of educate customers about. So I think these are the kind of tools you want to build up and support as we see these technologies progress further in the future.
That's really helpful. I appreciate it. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Fincher, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for having this great hearing today. The increased adoption of digital assets and the use of blockchain technology has the potential to change the world by lowering the cost of services for everyday Americans and increasing the security and clarity of digital transactions. However, the past few years we saw President Biden wage a war on digital assets, which squashed innovation and brought regulatory uncertainty to the marketplace. I want to thank President Trump and this community for recognizing that this help spurs on innovation by providing clear rules of the road and growth of digital assets in the United States. The bill before us today establishes distinct roles for the SEC and the CFTC, providing a structured pathway for digital asset firms to operate legally and with confidence, ensuring consumer protections through strengthened transparency and accountability in the marketplace, fostering innovation through regulatory structure to encourage businesses to remain in the U.S. Ms. Ching, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. Your experience in the industry has great perspective. In your testimony, you emphasize the importance of regulatory clarity for token issuance and distribution. From your perspective, how does this bill ensure emerging blockchain applications are not unintentionally stifled by over-rigid or over-ambitious compliance frameworks? And then also, how does this benefit us also?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'd like to talk back a little bit about the story of Aptos Labs and answer this question. Aptos Labs was founded here in the U.S. In 2021, and we did face a lot of uncertainty when it came to launching our token and the token issuance and distribution of it. We spent a lot of time trying to understand the previous launches and see what the best practices were in the space, but ultimately we had to launch with a lot of uncertainty. This bill and the Clarity Act is going to really help projects like ours to understand what the right rules are and how to understand the framework that best supports American innovation. I also talked to hundreds of builders across the country. Many of them do not have the resources we have that can actually support that kind of investigation. This bill will really help them to get a lot of certainty and clarity in the market. Today, there are roughly estimated to be about 10,000 developers of blockchain technology, yet there are millions of programmers around the world and millions in the US alone. We'd love to see these programmers start to leverage their talents much more towards this technology base here in the US as this Clarity Act becomes very, very much a reality in the everyday world.
Oh, that is fantastic. I'm glad to hear the benefits. I mean, there's so many great benefits that this is going to create. Mr. Miller, this bill gives the CFTC new authority regulating jurisdiction over digital commodities, cash or spot markets. I want to talk about this a little bit. Can you speak how this expanded jurisdiction would close existing regulatory gaps and why CFTC oversight of spot markets is critical for protecting consumers and ensuring market integrity?
Thanks for the question, of course. So what the CFTC brings to bear is its expertise in markets, bids and offers, liquidity, preventing manipulation, preventing trading misconduct. And while today we have crypto markets that have some state regulatory programs, there's no clear trade surveillance, market monitoring, and market conduct obligations under those programs. The CFTC makes those the fundamental tenets of their regulatory approach.
Thank you. So what would you say to banks? I know banks are sort of concerned about some of these aspects.
Yeah, so banks want to ensure that they've got clarity from their regulators that they are permitted to operate in any given asset class. And I think as we get more clarity around the types of products the CFTC and the SEC are regulating, the bank regulators get more and more comfortable about giving the banks the ability to deploy their capital into these markets. And ultimately that brings up liquidity and it brings up the resiliency of the markets with more participants.
That's great. So it's sort of a win-win for everybody.
It's all moving in the right direction.
Yep. All right. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think this hearing is timely considering the fact that we will, I believe, next week be marking up the Clarity Act. And I regret for those who testified earlier that I missed your comments, but I'm going to ask some questions and maybe you have already opined on that statement. But clearly, at this point in time, there does not appear to be a real regulatory framework in our country to deal with the efforts of digital assets and how those are transferred. Is that correct?
I'll say yes. Yeah, there's 55 million Americans who hold digital assets, and it's not clear what the regulatory environment is for the service providers of that business.
And have you, the four of you, had an opportunity to look at the markup, the draft of the Digital Market Clarity Act that we will be hearing next week?
I've studied pieces of it.
I
yes.
see a couple heads nodding. Let's start. Is it Chelsea Pizzola?
Yes, sir.
Do you think that this really establishes that level of framework? And if so, what is lacking or what is problematic in your view?
I do think this establishes the appropriate framework for regulation of digital commodity markets within the United States. I think the bill appropriately allocates jurisdiction between the CFTC and the SEC in a way that sort of reverses the prior ambiguity that had driven digital commodity markets offshore.
Mr. Miller, do you agree?
I agree. It's thoughtful and balanced. It invites the regulators to coordinate, but it creates clear allocations of registration authority.
Any critiques on the current draft on how we can make changes or improve it as we look toward next week's hearing?
I think the biggest issue is that it's not adopted.
It's not what?
It's not adopted. It's not passed.
Oh, okay. Got it. No, I was reading some of the background. There's no obviously comprehensive framework at this point in time. Only 9 of the digital asset service providers have registered with the SEC. 5 of those firms registered pursuant to settlement agreements arising from SEC enforcement actions, and no digital asset service provider is registered with the SEC as a national security exchange, so therefore there's no regulated platform to deal with trading of these digital asset securities. You would agree?
Congressman, I would say yes, that the Clarity Act provides that framework for them to do that. And then on your earlier question, just to add to what they were saying, I note that the Clarity Act is a substantial improvement from the discussion draft that was out there, and I really appreciate the fact that the staff and the members really took to heart some of the feedback that was coming in from folks on things like the definition of affiliated persons and how to deal with sort of dual registration and stuff. As far as what else needs to get done in my testimony, I point out that continue to work with the SEC and CFTC staff. They're the ones that are going to have to implement this. And the Clarity Act was just
And do you believe that the SEC, this will then, if enacted into law, will give them the necessary tools to provide the regulatory oversight necessary to protect businesses from engaging in these transactions?
Yes, and it preserves their exemptive authority to allow them to tailor the regulations that fit this market that are unique and a little bit different than some of the markets they already oversee.
Dr. Ching, do you agree?
From our point of view, we've been studying the FIT 21 and the Clarity Act. We see a lot of improvements as well. Thank you for the feedback that I think has been provided by many counterparties, including ourselves. Overall, we're very positive about the direction of this.
So you agree?
Yes, I agree.
That's along with, by the way, I'm a bit curious. Aptos Labs, I'm familiar with Aptos, California. Does this have
It is
anything to do
exactly
with
the
it?
same, yeah, so Aptos is a city in your state, and we
Yes,
named
it
after
is.
that. Yes.
It's a nice part of California.
Beautiful
Okay.
place.
Finally, in terms of comparative analysis, what do you, or is there, I guess, is the better question, in Europe or in Asia that would compare to establishing this type of a regulatory framework for the SEC? Is there anything that other parts of the world that they're already doing?
I was going to say, so, we have a unique structure here where we have the SEC and CFTC as two markets regulators. Most places have a single market regulator, so there's a little bit of nuances that are going on there. Other places have moved, but, because we're the biggest market in terms of, and I've talked about how our capital markets are the envy of the world, we're soon going to have the digital asset markets that are going to be the envy of the world, too, once the SEC and CFTC start implementing the regulations with the authorities that you provide them.
Well, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, but I think it is helpful as we're moving forward on this effort to ensure that we complement our efforts, because these efforts and transactions not only include the continental United States, but obviously other parts of the world where we do business. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Now please recognize the gentleman that represents the rice and duck capital of the western United States, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Well finessed, Mr. Chairman, well finessed. Western, so Arkansas must not be the West. Appreciate it. I'll put our rice and ducks up against anybody's. Anyway, I wanted to clarify something that was mentioned earlier in this committee on a concern about the funding for CFTC and its ability to do the work. And it is my understanding that it will be self-sustained through the next 4 years through a fee schedule that it will have on those being regulated. So I understand it. It's called Section 410. So there was a contention earlier that there wouldn't be the resources for CFTC to do the work, but that's not the case. So that said, a couple thoughts on core principles. This will be focused on Ms. Pizzola. As we know, the core principles are a critical part of how the CFTC regulates. And would you mention just some of the core principles that the Commission applies to these designated markets? How are they similar to the core principles applied to digital exchanges in the Clarity Act, so that we can get the contrast?
Of course. Thank you, Congressman. I think some of the key core principles that apply to DCMs that have analogs in the Clarity Act are requirements to provide a competitive, open, and efficient market that, that's really meant to protect the on-exchange price discovery process. I think similarly, a core principle requiring publication of trading data in a timely manner. It's again meant to protect the price discovery mechanism on exchanges. I think, as Mr. Miller mentioned earlier, that the requirement to monitor trading, to prevent manipulation, price distortion, and disruptions, requirements to protect markets and market participants from abusive practices, these types of really sort of market integrity and market transparency mechanisms, I think, are a key reason that the CFTC regulated markets have functioned so well over the previous decades. And I think the fact that the Clarity Act has these core principles, or sort of analogs of those core principles, really is promising for its ability to sort of have similarly robust digital commodity markets. But I think at the same time, that the Clarity Act appropriately adds sort of additional core principles that are tailored for digital assets. For example, there are requirements to disclose information that's specifically relevant to digital assets, like digital asset economics, source code, transaction history, that maybe aren't sort of, you wouldn't see those requirements for other commodities because they just aren't applicable. But I think in that regard, the Clarity Act is very appropriately tailored to digital assets in the core principles that it sets forth.
All right, thank you. Just following up on then, how do these core principles work to ensure that the exchanges are well run, as well as provide strong consumer protection?
Well, I think some examples of ways that the core principles ensure exchanges are well run are sort of things like, record keeping requirements, requirements to, have system safeguards in place, obligations to, undergo examinations, for example. I think those are ways that, both the regulators can come in and make sure that, there are records, there are, and also I think financial integrity and financial resourcing requirements. Those are all sort of ways that if the CFTC, for example, will come in and make sure that the exchange is, through examining records and through looking at the exchange's financial wherewithal, will make sure that it's being appropriately run and that, there aren't any cybersecurity or other system safeguard requirements or concerns.
Okay. All right, I'd still like to follow up on some of the FTX situation previously with my remaining time and shoot this to Mr. Miller. Could you, and maybe it's been answered, but I'd like to hear a little more on what would have happened, what do you think it would have been like if the situation, if these consumer protections had been in place in the Clarity Act for these digital assets if they'd been regulated under Clarity Act? How much better would that have turned out?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. So you would have had an audit and examination requirement over customer funds, and you would have had an obligation of customer funds to be held in a segregated way. Those three tools ensure that customer funds cannot be accessed by founders, malfeasance, acting persons, or otherwise. And so in the FTX case, there wouldn't have been a path for the founding team to access the customer funds without a regulator knowing about it.
Okay, good. Appreciate that. Thank you both. And Mr. Chairman, I know with Mr. Crawford out of the room, we really do know where the best rice comes from. So thank you. I yield back, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Now please recognize Mr. Tandor for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank the members here, all of you, to be here and educate us and give us your expertise. I want to thank the bipartisan coalition, including Chairman Thompson and Chairman Johnson, and ranking members Craig and Davis, who introduced the Clarity Act. Effective digital asset regulation is key to a successful market where both buyers and sellers of digital assets can thrive. This bill, while not perfect, represents a major step in the right direction to ensure that United States can be a leader in future innovation in the digital asset market. I'm a serial entrepreneur myself, and I'm looking at this from the entrepreneurial community. And is the Clarity Act, how does that help? And my question is to any one of you on the panel. How does this Clarity Act help in assuring the entrepreneurial community to stay in the United States, because they could go take their laptops and computers and go anywhere in the world? How does this help them to stay in the United States, keep the development, the innovation here in the United States? How does this Clarity Act help? And do you see areas where this Clarity Act lack in giving that confidence that we do have a regulatory environment where they can foster and do better? So just wanted to get your input on any of this.
I'll start with, and thank you for the question, Congressman. As a fellow entrepreneur, I can say that launching tokens in the U.S. has been difficult. We went through a lot of challenges in launching our own token and a lot of uncertainty back in 2022. We already know that the internet has yielded so many great innovations in the U.S., from Netflix to Facebook to Amazon to Google and so on and so forth. I'd love to see the next iteration of these entrepreneurs happen, for Web3 in America. And in order to have that happen, we have to have that regulatory clarity. We have millions of programmers here who are going to careers in other places, in other fields, because the lack of clarity that exists today. And I think with the Clarity Act, no pun intended, we're going to start to see that innovation happen here in America at tremendous scale. We've talked to so many different projects in this space about what they want to do and how they want to launch tokens and how they want to build innovative products, whether it's digital identity, payments infrastructure, commerce. And what we do see is that this lack of clarity makes it challenging for them. They don't have necessarily the resources to invest to find out how to best do things. And so I do believe strongly that with this new legislation, it is going to lead to a huge innovation wave within America, and America can be strong leaders in this space of blockchains and Web3.
All right. Well, many of you are familiar with the FIT 21 bill from last Congress. Where does Clarity Act improve upon FIT 21, and where does it take a step backwards? Anyone?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think what the Clarity Act gives us is direct and clear registration requirements. They tell the businesses and the founders, the entrepreneurs, where to go and which licenses they need. That is important. It also creates space for innovation around decentralized finance, and it instructs the regulators to continue thinking about that topic while leaving space for innovation. I think those are two critical components.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank the gentleman. Recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, I read your CV here, and it's very impressive. I do have one question, though. You're welcome. I see that you're the general counsel for FTX US. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How did that turn out?
So you might recall or have heard in the news that the global FTX group entered into bankruptcy in November of 2022.
When were you on board?
I joined in 2021 and left after the bankruptcy filing.
Did you contribute, or did you profit financially from FTX?
My role there was as the general counsel of FTX US.
Was not my question. I asked you if you profited from the failure of FTX.
I did not profit from the failure of FTX.
Okay. Well, thank you for clearing that up. I'm going to ask you, starting with you, Doctor. Tell me if this is an accurate statement, please. Bitcoin is a decentralized, scarce, and secure network for transferring value without any ability to restrict it. Altcoins are unregulated tech startups that regularly result in massive losses by retail investors while their promoters get rich. Is that accurate?
I definitely have my views, but
is that accurate?
In my view, I would think not. But
why not?
I think it's really this space.
How is that inaccurate? I guess would be the way to phrase that.
I think this space is lack of clarity around regulation, and this is really led to that issue.
Good to go. Sir, Bitcoin is a decentralized, absolutely scarce, and secure network for transferring value without any ability to restrict it. Altcoins are unregulated tech startups that regularly result in massive losses by retail investors while promoters get rich. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I don't invest in altcoins, and they're not under the SEC's jurisdiction.
So you have no idea what you're talking about then? Is that what you're telling me?
No. The ones that are under the SEC jurisdiction are the ones that I'm more familiar with, initial coin offerings and things like that. So altcoins, meme coins, stable coins, the SEC has said that they're not under the same jurisdiction.
So you're narrowly focused on one thing, and you don't have a broad understanding of this entire ecosystem?
I have a casual understanding of it, but as an expert testifying, it's based on the SEC's.
Right on. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller?
Yes, sir.
Do you want me to read that again? Bitcoin is a decentralized, scarce, and secure network for transferring value without any ability to restrict it. Altcoins are unregulated tech startups that regularly result in massive losses by retail investors while promoters get rich. Is that an accurate statement?
So I think we have several enforcement fraud-based actions against
That's not what I'm asking you. If we can reflect on your former vocation or current vocation when you were the general counsel of FTX, would that statement be accurate?
The statement
Did retail
identifies
investors get fleeced?
There are altcoin offerings that we should not have, and the Clarity Act will make them
So
no
I'm not
longer
talking about the
workable.
act, sir. I'm asking you a very direct question. So did retail investors get fleeced while a bunch of people got rich? One guy went to prison for 25 years. working with FTX, which you're the general counsel of there, sir. You should be intimately familiar with this. Is that an accurate statement or not?
There were customer losses when FTX filed for
enough of
insolvency.
that. Ma'am, we're not listening. So is that an accurate statement? Should I read it again for you, please? Do you need? Okay, here you go. Bitcoin is a decentralized, scarce, and secure network for transferring value without any ability to restrict it. Altcoins are unregulated tech startups that regularly result in massive losses by retail investors while promoters get rich. Is that an accurate statement?
Congressman, we have seen altcoin failures that did, result in investor losses. I think we've seen, in other markets, we've seen, similarly, we sometimes see stocks go to zero and see massive losses. But I do think the bill puts in place the kind of disclosure mechanisms and other, protections against insiders sort of dumping tokens
Awesome.
that I think help.
Thank you. And I want to be crystal clear. I view these types of currencies as a way to help guard against tyranny. And I want them to be independent from the government. They should be regulated only to the point where we can't fleece people, like Mr. Miller is the general counsel for FTX, so that happened. I don't want that to happen again. But these currencies are critical for us to maintain freedom. We have to be able to exchange in commerce without the government getting in our business. And so I'm supporting your efforts. I just want you to really focus on what the heck's going on here and understand it ain't about you. It's not about, making a dollar off another dollar. It's about making sure that American citizens and world citizens, because these are global commodities, to make sure that they have the ability to transact amongst themselves without the United States government or other governments getting into our business. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Takuda from the great state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses that are here. Aloha, Dr. Ching. It's great to see another kama'aina in the room. The potential for digital assets to transform our modern financial systems is undeniable, and I appreciate the committee's commitment to developing a thoughtful, bipartisan framework to regulate these new technologies. Last Congress, we took steps to develop a modern framework for regulating digital assets with the FIT 21 Act, and many of us did raise strong concerns that the legislation did not go far enough in establishing strong consumer protection standards, particularly around disclosures, fraud prevention, and cybersecurity safeguards. In the wake of several high-profile cases of cryptocurrency fraud and bankruptcy among crypto exchange companies, as was just mentioned, like the collapse of FTX in 2022, I believe it's crucial that we bake robust, strong consumer and investor protections into our regulatory framework for digital asset markets. We have an important opportunity with the Clarity Act to prevent future market catastrophes by setting the right conditions to ensure security and transparency for investors while also promoting innovation in this area. Mr. Pivovar, your testimony highlights the importance of consumer protection measures in federal security laws, such as disclosure requirements that aid informed decisions and best interest standards, and other fiduciary duties that ensure fair treatment. As we develop frameworks for regulating digital assets, what are the key customer protection elements that we should take into consideration? And how do the protections in the Clarity Act compare to those provided by the SEC for other types of financial transactions?
Thank you for that question. It's the same ones that the SEC already has, right? So one, investor protect, the foundation is disclosure, right? So giving proper disclosure about meaningful information to make informed investment decisions about whether to buy, sell securities, or vote their shares. So that's where it starts with. Then there's the protection of the actual customer assets, and Ryan talked about it at the CFTC. It's basically the same thing at the SEC. It's different underlying laws, but it's basically the same thing where you safeguard the customer assets, you don't allow the company to play with those assets, and in the event of a failure of the firm, that those customer assets are moved very quickly to a solvent institution that is there. And so those are very much the same. And then you mentioned best interest standard. There's the conflicts of interest that are still there involved with not putting the firm's interest in front of the customers. So whether it's best interest for broker-dealers or whether it's a fiduciary duty for investment advisors or best execution requirements in terms of the trading that's involved. Those are all principles-based. And we've talked about the benefits of principle-based regulations, that they can be tailored for the specific markets.
Is there anything in particular that you would want to add or strengthen when it comes to customer consumer protection into the act itself, or?
I think what the Act recognizes is that the disclosures for digital assets are not going to be the same as for public companies in a couple ways. One, what is disclosed and how long it's disclosed. What I really like about the Act is that when you have public companies or investment companies, they stay securities for their entire life, right? When it comes to digital assets, you have this issue of early on a central common enterprise, which is the definition that's used under the Howey test for an investment contract. You have control by insiders. Insiders have information around the public offering. But as the blockchain matures, and I really like the phrase that's used in there in the Act, evolves or matures into a decentralized blockchain system, that information becomes less important, and in fact, the control goes away, and so the disclosure requirements sort of go away as the blockchain becomes mature. So I think that's an appropriately tailored way to think about it. Now, in terms of whether it's got the exact numbers and the right numbers in there, this is where I think the SEC staff can be very helpful in providing some maybe tweaks around the edges in terms of getting the specifics right.
Okay, I'm pretty sure it was addressed, but I do think oversight discussions is really critical as we develop this as well. Actually, I wanted to move on to you, Dr. Ching. For myself, it is always an issue of accessibility, especially in our rural and remote communities like where both of us grew up. And one of the promises of new financial technology is that it can broaden financial access. But for that to happen, rural communities like ours, many of which still face gaps in broadband access and limited exposure to financial innovation, need to be able to come along for the ride, if you will. So as somebody that comes from the state of Hawaii, I'm sure you're familiar with the challenges we face with connectivity, especially on the neighbor islands. Rural communities also tend to have higher underbanked population. Can you speak to the role a federal framework for digital asset markings can play in promoting equitable access to new financial technologies?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I just want to start off by saying I think education is a big piece of this. I participated in the first inaugural Hawaii Blockchain Summit last year, and also been exploring some efforts in the islands around tokenizing driver's licenses, as well as some efforts even in Molokai to support different kinds of value exchange using blockchain-based technology. I do share your concerns as well, though, with the lack of broadband access. That it is difficult for everyone within the islands to kind of experience and benefit from the technology as well. Earlier on in, I think, the hearing, we did discuss that blockchain is undergoing transformation where perhaps not without internet access, you can still interact with each other and then have those transactions settled to the blockchain at a later point when they do come into contact with the internet. And so we're going to, from our point of view, explore those technologies to make sure we can actually enable that in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for always prioritizing access in rural America, like both of our districts. Thank you. I yield back.
Very good. In the queue is Mr. Rose, followed by Mr. Mesmer at this time. And with that, the gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Chair Thompson and Ranking Member Craig for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time to be with us today. Mr. Pivawar, regarding Section 109 of the Clarity Act, which pertains to international cooperation, I'd like to explore the safeguards the SEC would likely implement when entering into information sharing agreements with foreign regulatory authorities. Specifically, what measures would the SEC take to ensure that sharing sensitive information with foreign regulators doesn't compromise U.S. national security or the proprietary business interest of digital asset companies?
Thank you for that question. The information sharing agreements with the SEC primarily are in the enforcement context and are information about fraud that is global in nature. So if you have somebody perpetrating fraud from one country and it affects U.S. investors, and then the proceeds of that fraud are put into a bank or a financial institution in another country, the information sharing agreements allows the SEC to find out from the regulators where the fraud was being perpetrated, to try to stop that fraud, and then also to work with the regulators in the other countries to freeze the bank accounts to get the customer money back for the customers.
Thank you for that. The Clarity Act requires 4 joint rulemakings between the SEC and the CFTC in order to set up efficient and functioning digital commodity markets. Importantly, these joint rulemakings clearly delineate the respective responsibilities. Opponents of this bill have criticized these joint rulemakings, citing the practical challenges of the SEC and CFTC coordination. Mr. Pivawar or Mr. Miller, and you both can speak to this, can you highlight some of these joint rulemakings and explain why it is essential for the CFTC and SEC to coordinate on these matters?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Yeah, in my testimony, one of my recommendations was to try to narrow the amount of actual joint rulemaking that has to go through on the back end. Having been at the SEC and implement some of the Dodd-Frank implementations where many of them were joint rulemakings, it's difficult to do those, so I would urge you to look through, or actually talk to the staff and see how much you can get done on the front end, because it slows it down on the other end. It's not because they don't work well together, it's just because they have different authorizing statutes, different ways of looking at things, and their time could be better spent actually implementing the regulations rather than actually writing them.
Thank you for the question. We're trending towards a single marketplace with equities, cryptocurrencies, other tokenized assets. And so the exchange places, in many respects, might be dual registered. And so the two agencies, if the exchange place is registered with both of them, need to identify a primary regulator and figure out what the role of the other regulator is. And there's a history at the two agencies of doing this, all the way back to Shad Johnson, through the Dodd-Frank Act and going forward. So I believe they will do it. I do agree with Commissioner Pivawar that the more instruction that comes in the legislation, the better.
Thank you. And so I take it both of you think it's not ideal but inescapable that there need to be the joint rulemakings. Is that a fair?
Yeah, there's some issues where they just have to get together and do it. So I'll give one quick example is futures contracts on stock market indexes, right? So a futures contract on the S&P 500 index is given to the CFTC, right, for jurisdiction. But if you have a single stock futures contract, that behaves exactly like the stock, and you're concerned about insider trading, and so the SEC would be the implementing and is given jurisdiction over that. But what do you do with narrow-based indexes of 3 or 4 or 5 or 9 stocks or whatever? Well, that was where the SEC and the CFTC had to come together on Shad Johnson and some other things, and come together and actually hammer out those things. So there are some places where they have to hammer out those things, but the more you can sort of handle those on the front end, the quicker the rulemakings will actually get done.
And I believe as a part of recent executive action that you're going to end up going through OIRA a couple of times on these things. Do you have concerns about that?
I do not. I've always been a strong proponent of cost-benefit analysis, economic analysis at the agencies. The agencies have always been subject to judicial review and have had rules thrown out on cost-benefit analysis. I think going through additional review actually would kind of help and decrease the risk of having these things overturned.
All right. I think my time's expired, so I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. The gentleman from Indiana is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. Dr. Ching, you mentioned that Aptos had to fight through regulatory inefficiencies to make its way to market. Did the lack of clarity impact your start date, harm your revenue, or decrease or delay customers' involvement?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. It mainly impacted our ability to launch to market, time to market, as well as impacted our ability to understand exactly how we could educate folks about token usage. We definitely tried to be as conservative as possible, and also just play by best practices.
Okay, can we assume the challenges you faced are endured by other blockchain technologies?
Definitely, we are not alone in this space.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Miller and Dr. Ching, as individuals who have experienced the extremes of the current regulatory system and the absence of statutory structure, each of you has an enlightening perspective to share. On one end of the spectrum, honest investors are being punished, while on the opposite end of the spectrum, spotty regulations have a lot of bad actors to cause incredible damage. Would each of you speak to how the Clarity Act provides regulatory guide rails, as described in Mr. Miller's testimony, instead of a blanket that suffocates innovation?
I think thank you for the question. Our learned experience as markets professionals is that responsible regulation promotes innovation, promotes growth, and promotes the deployment of capital. And so I think that's where the Clarity Act is striking the right balance. It says here is a structure, opt into it, you get certainty, and then you can do your business.
Okay, thank you.
I also agree with that. I'm very supportive of all your efforts.
Okay, super. Thank you. With the obvious failure of the current regulatory structure to support innovation in digital asset markets, I feel the need to ask why it's taken so long to pass legislation. But I think your testimonies have already explained the draft and redraft nature of Congress and the regulatory pendulum of administrations very well. The Clarity Act, like you said in your testimony, Dr. Miller, marks a bold step in actually producing a legislative solution. It does so using input gathered not only from this year's round of comments, but last year's as well. One of the notable strengths of the Clarity Act is the inclusion of the CFTC's core principles regulation. Mr. Miller, how can you speak that this adaptive regulatory style will keep the legislation relevant in an ever-changing industry?
Thank you for the question. So the core principles approach in the Commodity Exchange Act and CFTC rules allows innovators and entrepreneurs to build their business and educates them on what the expectations are from a principles-based perspective of regulators. And I think that approach has proven durable over the years, and it's the right approach now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Now, Ms. Pizzola, do you think the Clarity Act checks the right regulatory boxes in integrating both prescriptive and adaptive methods to govern digital asset market structures?
Congressman, yes, I do. I think it appropriately provides the kind of flexibility that Mr. Miller was just talking about for exchanges, to tailor their compliance methods to their particular business models, which I think we've seen be very successful in regulation of designated contract markets. So I think there's that flexibility that's appropriate for the exchanges. I think for the regulated intermediaries, the regulation is a bit more prescriptive in some areas, sort of record keeping, chief compliance officer requirements, disclosures, things of that nature. And I think it's, perhaps appropriately so, a little bit more prescriptive, just because there is that direct interface that those intermediaries have with customers. They may be receiving customer funds, but they're also, interacting on a daily basis with those customers. So there may be sort of more instances for, trust building, but also for potential, fraud and things like that when you sort of got face-to-face interaction or otherwise direct interaction every day.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both. I'm encouraged that the text in front of us and heartened that developers, lawyers, and regulatory experts here have come together in agreement that the Clarity Act gets it right. So thank you all, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you to the gentleman from Indiana. Before we adjourn today, I invite the ranking member to share any closing comments she may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. If this hearing proved anything, it is that there's bipartisan agreement that we need clear rules of the road to provide sufficient customer protections for retail investors and to allow innovators in this space to do what they do best. The Clarity Act is a good first step toward this shared goal. I want to thank the witnesses for joining us to share the firsthand perspective that we need to make informed public policy. And I want to thank the chairman here for holding this hearing. I hope we can continue, and the subcommittee chairman. I hope we can continue to work together to strengthen this bill and broaden support for it in the U.S. House. I still firmly believe that any market for digital assets must be fair. If the United States is to be a leader in this space, we must make sure digital assets do not become an avenue for political corruption. But we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that a little bit later. Again, thank you, and I yield back.
We're on the cusp of something special here, major victory for consumers, markets, and innovators. And I think it's remarkable. I want to thank the hearing panelists today, because I do think the standard DC way all too often is to do things that are polarized and partisan, insular, uninformed, kind of detached sometimes from the real work of a marketplace. And yet this process, the Clarity Act, building on the successes of Fit 21, has been the opposite of that. It has been bipartisan, it has been collaborative, it has been informed, and it has been done together in a bipartisan and bicameral conversation and with many stakeholders from really across the technology and consumer protection sphere. And I think we are, Madam Ranking Member, at a spot where we can make further improvements to the bill and ultimately land in a place that is going to be a huge success for everyone involved. With that, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplemental written responses from the witnesses to any questions posed by a member. With that, this hearing of the Committee on Agriculture is adjourned.